You're listening to Inheritance of Secrets, written by Robin Patchen, narrated by Brian and Matilda. Copyright 2022 by Robin Patchen. Audio copyright 2024 by Robin Patchen.
Chapter 1. Her throat swelling, her eyes burning with tears she wouldn't release, Aspen Kincaid held her father's hand. At the restaurant the night before, he'd been perfectly fine in his serious, tender way. That morning, she'd been awakened by a call from a police officer. Dad had been riding his bicycle, something he did along the narrow roads near their apartment every single day. A teenage driver, not paying attention, had swerved into him. Aspen had made it to the hospital just moments after he did, and had been waiting in the ER when a nurse called her back, telling her to hurry, hurry. Aspen had run, skidding past doors and machines and doctors until she reached the room. Now she stood at Dad's bedside and took his hand, trying not to react to the scrapes and cuts on his face and neck, to the way his breath wheezed. This was the man who'd raised her and loved her so well. His kind brown eyes were rimmed with red. His tan face was pale. She brushed his hair back, feeling soft strands and gritty sand left from the fall. She lifted a prayer and tried to smile. "How you feeling?" Before he could gather enough breath to respond, a white-coated doctor and 4 other people crowded in, one pushing a machine. "You've got 5 minutes," the doctor said. "Then we need to do this." "Do what?" "Intubate." One of his lungs collapsed, and the other. "What are you waiting for? Do it." Panic rising in her chest, she stepped back. "Why did you wait?" The doctor only nodded toward her father, who said, "I have to talk." He took a wheezing breath. "To you first." He gasped, and she felt the pain of it, inhaling and exhaling with him as if she could infuse him with her strength. "We can talk after, Dad," she said. He shook his head. The doctor squeezed her arm. He insisted. A flicker of sadness filled his eyes, but he masked it quickly. "We'll be back in 5 minutes." He followed the others from the room, leaving the machine that would keep Dad alive until he recovered. "Dad, that was foolish." Aspen tried to keep her tone kind, despite her frustration. "You should have let them do what they do. What could be so important?" "I need to tell you." Another wheezing breath, then another. The tears she'd barely held back slipped down her cheeks. "There's nothing that can't wait." "About what happened to your mother." Her mother? Aspen's heart pounded, because those words told her 2 things in an instant. First, that Dad didn't believe he'd have another opportunity to talk to her, and second, that he'd been lying to her all her life. Aspen had heard a lot of words to describe her mother over the years, certainly more than her father had ever intended for her to hear. Unkind words from extended family who visited on occasion. Cracked, deranged, psychotic. But when Daddy talked about Mom, it was always with a kind, gentle tone. "Your mother was unwell, Aspen." Funny how, in all those words, what she remembered wasn't the adjectives used to describe the woman who'd given birth to her, the woman she had no memory of. It was the verb, was, your, mother, was, past tense. Daddy had told her that, though no body had been found, she'd been presumed dead for years. He'd claimed not to know what happened to her. Aspen leaned closer to him, squeezing his hand, refusing to be angry in what could be their last moments together. "What about her, Dad?" "The house," he said. "You'll get the house." In all their years in Kona, despite his restaurant's successes, they'd never lived in a house. "The apartment? What about it?" He shook his head. "I'm sorry." He took a shallow breath. "I didn't do right, by her, or you. Don't." He gasped for breath. "I'm sure you did your best." Her voice squeaked. She leaned down and kissed his cheek. "You're a good, good man. I'm sure whatever you did, you felt you had to." Tears dripped from his eyes and soaked into the pillow beneath his head. He licked chapped lips and tightened his hold on her hand until her fingers ached. "Wanted to..." His words were interrupted by raspy breaths. "What do you want me to do?" He shook his head and pressed his hand to his chest. "Me." He shook his head, tapped his chest. "Find her. Do what I never had the courage to do." "What do you mean? Is she alive?" He opened his mouth to speak, but a cough choked out the words, the sound tearing through her soul like a dull knife against tough meat. The nurses hurried back in. One propped him higher, speaking words Aspen couldn't make out over his coughing and the dull roar whooshing through her brain. Another nurse gripped her shoulder. "You need to step out." "No." Her father's eyes filled with terror. "You don't. I have to." "Ma'am." The doctor's voice drew Aspen's attention. "We've got to do this now. I'm sorry." She tugged her hand, but Daddy held on and tried to speak. He didn't have the breath. "You're going to be all right?" Somehow, she didn't think it was fear of death that put that panic on his face. "Now, please." Someone tugged on her arm. "I love you, Daddy." She pulled her hand from his and moved into the hallway. She watched the scene through the open door, barely glimpsing her father beyond all the medical personnel trying so hard to save his life. It was too late. 3 days later, after he'd been airlifted to the trauma center in Honolulu, her father slipped into eternity. In his last moments, unconscious, the tube no longer down his throat, a smile graced his lips. She imagined him in that thin space between this life and the next, getting his first glimpse of the savior he'd loved and trusted as long as she could remember. As awful as her grief was, Aspen knew her daddy was at rest. She feared she never would be again. Chapter 2. 1 year later. Aspen's phone rang, and she hit the button on her steering wheel to answer it. "I meant to call earlier." Jaslyn Matsumoto's voice was the only thing that felt familiar in this unfamiliar landscape, and Aspen's eyes stung at the sound of it. "I take it you got there all right?" "I'm about an hour from Coventry now," Aspen said. "Are you going to the house tonight?" "It'll be dark by the time I get there, so I got a room in town. I may end up staying there, depending on what I find when I see the place. I'm meeting the contractor tomorrow morning." "How was the flight?" Aspen had kept her best friend informed about her plans in the months since she'd made the decision. It didn't matter that Jaslyn and her husband had moved to Kathmandu, where they served as missionaries. Now that Dad was gone, her best friend was the only person who cared enough about her to check in. She had other friends, of course, but over the years, most of them had married and had families. A few had moved away. Aspen had socialized with people she worked with, but since she'd left her job, she hadn't kept up with them. She wasn't sure how, but despite being surrounded by friendly faces all her life, she'd somehow become incredibly alone. "The flight was long," she said. "I don't know how you manage that all the time." "You get used to it. You know me. I love traveling." "You know me. I love staying home." Jaslyn laughed. "The car's all right?" Aspen had bought a used 4-wheel drive SUV online a couple of days before. "Just as advertised. I didn't even have to stay in Boston, thanks to the overnight flight." "But are you awake enough for the drive? What is it, 2 hours?" "Close to 3, but I'm fine. I slept a little on the plane." Very little, but she'd be in town by dinner time. Between her anxiety about what she was going to find and the multitude of caffeinated drinks, she wouldn't fall asleep behind the wheel. "What's it like in New Hampshire?" "Cold." "That, I guessed already. It's January. What else?" Aspen gazed around at the tall pines and naked trees, at the snow-topped mountains reaching to gray skies. "You know Mud Lane up in Waimea? All those tall trees? It's sort of like that, times a million and with snow." "I bet it's pretty." Aspen shrugged. "I'm just glad the roads are clear. It's getting dark already, even though it's only—" She glanced at the clock on the dash. 3:15. If there's a sunset somewhere, I can't see it, and the skies are cloudy and— Her voice hitched. She stopped talking before she revealed too much of what was swirling in her thoughts. "Oh, honey." Jaslyn always saw through her. "How are you? Really?" She swallowed a sob. I can't believe he's been gone a year. It feels like a blink, and it feels like a lifetime since I talked to him. I miss him so much. I wish I could be there with you. Fly over. How far could it be? Don't think I didn't consider it. It's only about a 24-hour flight. Aspen groaned at the thought. And probably $1 million. Not quite that bad. If you stay there, Danny and I will come visit for sure. That would be... The very thought of her best friend making a trip to see her choked her up again. But she wouldn't be staying. She didn't know a soul within 1,000 miles of New Hampshire. Once you get a good night's sleep, everything will seem brighter. You have a plan, of course. Aspen always had a plan. She had a notebook where she'd lined out exactly what she'd be doing when she got to New Hampshire, beginning with meeting the contractor and getting the renovations going. Then she'd search the house and figure out why her dad had bought it. Then well, it got a little murky after that. Somehow, she'd find her mother and do right by her, whatever that meant. If only Dad had given her a few more details. It didn't matter. The to-dos would fill themselves in. This is going to be good for you. Jaslyn's voice took on the confident tone she used whenever she talked about the Savior she trusted so well. God loves you, and He has good plans for you. I have a strong feeling that this trip is a big part of those plans. I hope you're right. Her life couldn't go forward until she unlocked the secret her father had tried to share. I'll be praying for you, my friend. Keep in touch. Aspen ended the call and swiped at her tears. Thoughts of her father gave way to thoughts of his final words, and then to the reading of the will in Kona. Her father had owned a house, one he'd purchased a couple of years before his death. He hadn't traveled to New Hampshire in that time, which meant he must have bought the place sight unseen. In Coventry, New Hampshire, the town he had grown up in, the town where Aspen had spent the first year of her life, the last place Aspen's mother had been seen alive. And Dad must have known something about her mother's disappearance, but he'd kept that information from Aspen. As hard as this was going to be, she was going to figure out why.
Chapter 3. Garrett McCarthy glanced back at the big old house. This was his opportunity to establish himself as a general contractor. He'd taken small jobs here and there, a kitchen remodel, an addition over a garage, but he'd never been hired to manage the renovation of an entire house. When he completed this job well, new opportunities should open up. He'd arrived at the 2-story home early that morning, plowed the drive, and had almost finished shoveling the walkway when the growl of an engine interrupted the silence. As remote as this house was, he assumed his client was arriving. With the shovel propped beneath his hand, he faced the road. A small red SUV turned down the long driveway and parked beside his pickup. A woman in a puffy parka, the hood pulled up over her head, stepped out of the vehicle and approached him. When she reached the shade of the house, she took off her sunglasses and pushed back her hood. His heart did a weird little hitch. He didn't know what he'd expected, but not this. She was beautiful with dark blonde hair and pale green eyes. Despite her puffy blue jacket, it was clear that she was trim and fit and... Aspen Kincaid. She held out her hand, covered in what looked like expensive leather, and he yanked off his dirty work glove to shake it. Garrett McCarthy, welcome to your house. She looked up at it, and so did he, feeling protective of the old place that had been so poorly used in recent months. The cedar siding was faded, splintered in places. The concrete steps behind him, though clear of snow, were cracked, and the iron railings listed to one side. From the front, it didn't look like much, especially with the rise that blocked most of the structure from the road. But despite all that, the fresh snow enshrouding it made it look, well, if not new, then at least bright and clean. He couldn't read the look on her face. She seemed shocked. It's not as bad as it seems, he said. We can freshen up the siding or even paint it. Though the thought of painting it did not set well. Either way, it'll look great when we're done. A few of the rooms have been updated already, not the kitchen or most of the baths. He'd have to explain about the creepy rooms in the basement, but not yet. It's functional. You should be able to live here while we do the renovations. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to defend the property. It was what it was. Maybe it wasn't her dream home. But his understanding was that she'd inherited the place free and clear. Whatever she could sell it for would be money in her pocket. And the renovation price would be money in Garrett's, as long as she didn't choose a different contractor. Her attorney, an old friend of his uncle's, had recommended she hire him, though there were plenty of other guys who were looking for work in the winter. "You'll see the potential," he said, "once we go." "It's not that." Her voice had taken on a breathy quality. She backed up a few steps into the snowy yard. She wore waterproof boots that looked brand new, so she'd probably barely realized she was standing in 6 inches of snow as she gazed toward the second floor. "It's so big." She looked up the hill that rose in front and to the side of the property, then to the trees on the other side. And all this land. So much land. He wasn't sure what to say to that. She'd seen photos, hadn't she? She'd understood what she'd inherited. They'd talked about it on the phone. She looked at him, her smile shy, maybe embarrassed. "It's just, I can't believe my dad owned this." "You didn't know?" She shook her head. "We never owned a house. The biggest place I've ever lived was a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment. It had a small office and a large living room, and it felt like the lap of luxury." Garrett waited until she seemed to shake off the confusion and awe. "You ready to see the inside?" "I am." She tucked her gloved hands under her arms. "It's cold out here." Then she squinted at him. "Aren't you freezing?" He'd worn a jacket that morning, but after working in the sun for an hour, he'd tossed it in the cab of his truck. Besides, it was almost 30 degrees. Not so much cold as slightly chilly. The temperature would be practically balmy that afternoon, over 40 degrees. Almost unheard of at this time of the year this high in the mountains. He probably looked like an idiot wearing a t-shirt and winter gloves. Shoveling is hard work. "Thanks for doing that. Wouldn't want you to drive through all that snow to get into your driveway and then walk through it to get to your door. Fortunately, I have a plow." Her brow furrowed and she glanced at the shovel in his hand. He couldn't help it. He laughed. "This is a snow shovel." She didn't seem offended by his amusement. "That makes sense. I've heard of plows, but I thought they were giant things used on highways and stuff." "There are giant ones for highways, and there are little ones for driveways and parking lots." He pointed to the front of his truck and the plow attached there. "Ah, must be convenient." "Incredibly." He didn't add that plowing was one of his sources of income in the winter months when most construction jobs were put on hold. After remodeling Aspen Kincaid's house, new opportunities would open up for him as long as he earned a good review. He climbed the steps and pushed open the front door. "Well, let's check it out."
Chapter 4. She gazed at the living room with its vaulted ceilings. A gorgeous gray stone fireplace took up one entire wall. On the other side, a staircase led to the second floor, where a walkway lined with doors was open to the living area below. Aspen had known the house was almost 3,000 square feet. She'd known it sat on 5 acres. She'd been told all that when Dad's lawyer had read the will. She'd even seen a few photos. She was still stunned. Maybe because, deep down, she'd hoped to walk in the door and find her mother. Dad had given Aspen the impression she was here. Or maybe Aspen had filtered his words through a heavy dose of wishful thinking. Still, she couldn't help but wonder if her mother was still alive. The thought thrummed in Aspen's chest, beating a rhythm of hope. When Aspen turned 13, she'd demanded to know what had happened to the woman who'd given birth to her. Dad had seemed reluctant, but she'd argued she was old enough to understand. Finally, he'd conceded. She could still see the kindness in his face when he sat her down that day. "Your mother suffered from a mental illness. When you were a baby, she got into some trouble, and then she disappeared. Though we've never found her, she is presumed dead." Aspen had wanted to hope Dad was wrong, but he'd been so confident, adding, "If she were alive, sweetheart, she would have come home." Daddy had always been honest with her, and she'd accepted his words as truth. But ever since he'd told her about the house, about how he hadn't done right by her mother, Aspen's hope that she'd find her alive had grown. And hope didn't disappoint, right? Wasn't that what the scriptures said? She had a feeling she was interpreting that wrong. Truth was, when she was thinking clearly, She couldn't imagine a scenario in which she wasn't disappointed by what she discovered. Nevertheless, she would stay on this journey until she learned the truth, however painful. Her focus shifted from her missing mother to the house. Had her mother ever been there? She must have. Why else would Dad have bought the place? Mom hadn't lived here, though, nor had her parents or dads. Aspen had done the research and discovered where both her mother and father had lived in high school and the first couple of years of college, and it wasn't here. After they married, they'd rented a house in town, but they hadn't had much money. Dad had told her that much. Surely they couldn't have afforded this. What was their connection to the house? It felt surreal being here, in a house she owned, an actual house on actual snow-covered land. She'd figured the place would be falling down. Wouldn't it have to be if her father'd had the money to purchase it? In cash? It wasn't, though. Not even close. Garrett crossed the scuffed and scratched hardwood floors and stopped beside an open door beneath the staircase. There was another door beside him, probably a coat closet. "Needs some work," Garrett said. "But the fireplace is in great shape. We need new paint on the walls, and I'd recommend painting that dark woodwork white or cream to brighten the place up. Obviously, the floors need to be refinished. You don't want to replace them. They're in great shape, and it's hard to find genuine hardwood these days. Everybody's putting in vinyl or laminate. These," he tapped his booted foot on the floor, "are unique. Other than that, this room doesn't need much." She pulled a notebook and pen from her purse and started jotting down everything he said. It felt so foreign, this contractor talking to her, as if she had the right to be there, to make decisions about a house she'd never even seen before. Everything felt so bizarre and out of control. She just needed to make a list. Stay organized. She could do this as long as she didn't let any detail slip away. After she wrote down what he'd said, she looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. She'd been so overwhelmed outside, she'd barely noticed the man who'd greeted her. Now she wasn't sure how she'd managed that. He had short, light brown hair that somehow was both messy and perfect, and he sported a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes were blue, his lips lifted in a slight smile. He wore jeans and a thin t-shirt, as if it weren't freezing outside. And inside, come to think of it. She rubbed her upper arms with hands still in rather useless leather gloves. She needed to get a pair like he'd been wearing. "You're not cold, are you?" He sounded amused. "It's no better than outside. Only about 40 degrees warmer. I turned on the heat yesterday. It's 69 in here, plenty warm. Maybe if you're an Eskimo, it's a wonder we can't see our breath." He chuckled, the sound deep and inviting. "Does it ever get cold in Hawaii?" "Sure, in some places. It snows at the top of Mauna Kea, but I've only been up there once." "Too far away?" "Too cold. Nothing's too far on the Big Island." Another low chuckle. As if Aspen hadn't been overwhelmed enough, now she had to deal with a gorgeous contractor with a voice that soothed and a smile that drew her in. "You'll get used to it," he said. "Truth be told, I set the thermostat for 72, figuring you'd prefer it warmer, but the furnace is having trouble keeping up. We'll need to talk about having it serviced. Meanwhile," he nodded to the fireplace, "I took the liberty of bringing you some firewood. I recommend you buy a cord, or at least a rick." "Cord? Rick? I assume these aren't people?" No." His expressive eyebrows lowered. She doubted if he had any idea how obvious his thoughts were. Right now, she'd guess he was thinking, "How dumb is this lady?" Might as well confirm his guess. "I've never started a fire in a fireplace." His eyes narrowed, almost as if he were suspicious. "Where do you usually start fires?" "You know, on the beach or at campsites. Outdoors." "You like to camp?" "Not in New Hampshire. You'd have to be out of your mind." "Stick around. It's not always winter." She didn't think she'd be staying long enough to experience the other seasons. She just wanted to find her mother. But, as long as she had to be there to do that, she might as well renovate the house before she put it on the market. It would give her an excuse to get to know the town where she'd spent the first year of her life. The town where Dad had grown up and Mom had lived. She'd sold Dad's restaurants to the manager of his first one. Jean had worked for Dad as long as Aspen could remember. Though she'd hated to part with the places that meant so much to her father, she wouldn't be going back to Hawaii anytime soon. Truth be told, even though she'd worked for Dad since she was old enough to wipe tables, she didn't love the restaurant business. The problem was, she didn't know what else she could do. Now, with no job, Dad gone, Jaslyn in Nepal, and the rest of her friends marrying or moving away, Kona held no appeal. When she finished up here, she was going to college in Florida to study hospitality and tourism. She'd probably be one of the oldest full-time students, but what did that matter? Though the school she'd chosen had a great reputation, she'd chosen it more because it was near her dad's parents. She hadn't seen them much as she'd grown up, but they were the only family she had any contact with anymore. There was no chance she'd be staying in the Great White North. "Should we continue?" Garrett pushed open the door he stood beside. She stepped through. Same floors, bare walls, small windows that looked out at a snow-covered hill. "No closet," Garrett said, "and there's no shower or bath on this floor, so it wouldn't work as a bedroom. Could be a second living area or an office, or even a formal dining room." He knocked on the wall behind him. "Kitchen's right here, so we could open it up." No chance she was getting that deep into renovations. She jotted down what he'd said. When she was finished, he stepped out, and she followed him through the living area to a door beneath the open walkway above. "This is the current dining room," he said. The space was barely large enough for a table for four. She crossed to the window on the back wall beside a narrow doorway. Beyond a snow-covered yard, the naked branches of 1,000 trees were covered with a thin layer of snow. Dark green pines rose higher than the rest, reaching toward the bright blue sky. It was gorgeous. "I guess you don't see a lot of scenes like that in Hawaii," Garrett said. "When I drove up yesterday, the world seemed gray and dingy. But this is... wow." She was still staring at the scene when he cleared his throat. "Like the living room, this room doesn't need much." The yellowing paint needed to be covered, as did the brass light fixture on the ceiling. It was dark even on the sunny day, the one small window not nearly large enough to take advantage of the view. "I don't know your budget," Garrett said, "but I have some recommendations for this room and the kitchen. If it were up to me, we'd tear this down." He knocked on the wall separating them from the living room, then pointed to another wall with a door. "And that one, open this up and make it a great room." "That's an idea." One she wouldn't be implementing. Garrett pushed open the door and waited until she walked through. The kitchen. It was as dark as the dining area, and everything was brown, from the cabinets to the wooden backsplash, from the butcher block countertop to the vinyl floor. Even the walls, which might have once been white, were so dirty they were practically brown. She groaned, and Garrett said, "Yeah. I know. It's outdated in every way." There was an almond-colored refrigerator and a green built-in oven that must have come straight out of the 70s. The dishwasher matched it in color and age. She couldn't help a laugh. "It's dreadful." Garrett smiled wide. "But imagine how beautiful it can be. Once we tear down these walls, it'll be open and spacious. You'll be able to see the fireplace from back here. We can put a bar where I'm standing, or maybe a peninsula that connects by the window, or maybe not. We could leave it open to the dining area. It would make the room so much more spacious." She could picture his vision. "It would be lovely, but..." "The cabinets are in great shape. I don't know how you feel about a white kitchen, but we could paint them white or even light gray. Replace the backsplash, add granite or quartz countertops." Catching his vision, she swiveled and pointed to a tiny window beside a door. "Any chance we could enlarge that?" "Absolutely. Maybe even replace both the window and the door with glass French doors to let in more light." "I love that idea." They could make this place beautiful. But that wasn't why she was there. She had to remember her purpose, and it wasn't to create her dream home in a place she had no desire to live. Whatever she sold this house for would be gravy to her. And how would renovating this place help her find her mother? She forced a smile. "Those are all great ideas, but I'm not that ambitious. I just want to do what we have to do to honestly be able to call it updated. So I'm on board with paint, new appliances, new countertops, and backsplash. We can have the floors refinished. Replace this. She scuffed her boot on the vinyl beneath her. But beyond that, this place is a world of potential. Don't you want to see what it can become? She shrugged. I'm not going to live here, so I honestly don't care that much. He sighed. It was clear that he wanted to say something more. Instead, he gestured back through the door. Let's keep going. After peeking into a downstairs half-bath off the kitchen, which looked like an explosion of 70s orange, they headed upstairs. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by the second floor. Garrett wasn't wrong. Dad's renter had painted the master bedroom and replaced the carpet. It was large enough for a king-sized bed and furniture. Like the ones downstairs, the windows were too small, especially considering the view. From this vantage point, she could see beyond the treetops to an expanse of white far below and a mountain rising in the distance. It's gorgeous! Reluctantly, she moved on to the bath, which, though outdated, was clean and functional. Back in the walkway overlooking the living area, Garrett said, "With new paint and refinished floors, the bedrooms will be fine. I mean, you could replace that tiny window in the master with a bay, but—" He glanced at her, his expression one of dismay. "Anyway, up here, just the bathrooms need a lot of work." He stopped by a door. "This one is the worst." Worse than what they'd found downstairs? She pushed through and got her answer. The peach-colored tub was cracked. The vanity's drawers were crooked. There was no mirror, just bare drywall where one should have been, and, above that, an opening for a light fixture. Wires poked out of it. A tiny window high on the wall over the tub enabled them to see the space without flashlights. Obviously, everything needs to be replaced in here. He was standing behind her, and when she turned to respond, found he was very close. He backed away. "Sorry, I was looking over your shoulder." "I'm glad the other bathroom is in decent shape, or living here would be very hard." "You got lucky there." He showed her 2 empty bedrooms in decent shape. "Keep the doors to the rooms you aren't using shut, and the other rooms will stay warmer." After she peeked into a linen closet, he stopped at the final door on the second floor. "This is where I put the things that were left. The house was filled with furniture and, well, you'll see." He opened the door, and she gasped at the sight. It was a bedroom, but filled with furniture, boxes, fabric. Stuff everywhere. "I got rid of some of it, but—" "Where did it all come from?" "Most of it was left by the renter. Some of it, I think, was left by the previous owners. Everything belongs to you, so I didn't feel right going through it or making decisions about it." "Why did the renter leave so much?" Garrett's eye contact slipped. "That's sort of a long story. I'll tell you later." An odd answer, but it didn't matter. She didn't care about the renter's stuff. She did care about anything left by the previous owners. Maybe the clues she needed to find her mother were in that room somewhere. She couldn't wait to start digging through it. Aspen thought their tour was over, but when they got back to the first floor, Garrett stopped beside the second door beneath the stairs. He looked nervous. "Uh-oh," she said. "What's behind door number 2? She meant it as a joke, but when he took a deep breath as if gathering courage, her heart rate sped up. "What? Damage or something? Are you storing a crazy relative down there?" "Crazy relatives are kept in the attic," he said, his lips twitching in an almost smile. "Everybody knows that." Bodies were buried in basements. Surely her mother wasn't. She cut off the thought with a shake of her head. Obviously, her mother's body wasn't lying in the basement in plain sight. She needed to get a grip. "Just tell me what's in the basement. You're freaking me out." Sorry. I'm just not sure how to—" "It turns out your renter was sort of a—well, he was a—" When he didn't continue, she said, "How bad can it be?" "A child pornographer and a kidnapper and, it turns out, a murderer." She stepped back, horrified. Oh, I had no idea. Surely my father didn't—" "Your dad died a year ago, right?" At her nod, he said, "The guy rented after that." It's a really long story, and thank God it had a happy ending. But he did some renovations down here. I just wanted to warn you. There's nothing gruesome or... No, no, nothing like that. It's just... Come on. It's easier just to show you. He opened the door, pulled a chain to turn on the light, and stepped aside for her. Thanks to the anxiety bubbling in her stomach, she wanted to ask him to go first, but she wasn't a child. She could do this. She took the rickety wooden staircase to the bottom and found a normal cement basement with a washer and dryer and one small window just below the ceiling, through which she could see nothing but snow. Shelves holding a few tools covered the wall straight ahead. Otherwise, the room looked perfectly normal. Except... She looked up at the ceiling, tried to imagine the floor plan upstairs. I'm probably just being paranoid, but it feels too small. I'm impressed you noticed. You alerted me to look for something, and there's nothing to see here. If she were staying, she'd definitely install better lighting to dispel the spooky factor. She stepped further into the room and saw a giant metal, something under the stairs. The furnace, Garrett said. Ah, that explains why it's warm down here. Come on. He crossed to the bookshelves, reached behind one, did something she couldn't see, and then pulled the shelf inward. Not just the shelf, though. It was a hidden door. Garrett stepped in and flipped a switch. As the light flickered on, she followed. There was one door on the far wall. Otherwise, the space was empty, but something creepy and terrifying slid down her spine. Despite the warmth, she suddenly felt cold and afraid. What is it? It's an empty room, he said, his voice soothing. Just an empty room. Why does it feel so... She didn't know how to finish her sentence without seeming like a crazy person. She wasn't crazy, was she? Familiar doubts crept in. Was she more like her mother than she'd known? Was she losing her mind? Do you feel it too? I know what you mean, he said. It's the hidden doorway, and... He gently shifted to the side so she could see it better. The locks. I took the liberty of removing them. I hope you don't mind. They only opened from the other room, and it seemed like a hazard. If someone were to get trapped in here, there's no way out. She saw the holes in the door and tried not to think about what he'd said. They were electronic locks, and they're still wired. We could turn this into a panic room if you wanted, or just remove the false wall entirely. So did he, the pornographer? This was his photography studio, but from what I understand, he was never able to use it. Garrett's gaze flicked to the empty space beside them, and she got the feeling there was something he wasn't telling her. She was too creeped out to ask. She focused on the door across from them. It, too, sported holes where locks must have been. Where does that lead? He pushed it open and turned on a light. It was a small bedroom with 2 twin beds, a nightstand, and a bureau. She opened a door and found a closet, where sheets and blankets and towels were stored. Another door led to a bathroom. Everything in both rooms looked brand new. I can move the beds to the master if you'd like. I got rid of the renter's mattress, the one he had there. I didn't figure you would want it. It was old, and also, you know. He was a... Good choice, yes, thank you. But these are brand new, Garrett said. Never used. You know this how? I was here when... He blew out a long breath. Let's go back upstairs. She wasn't sorry to leave that horrible place. Back in the living room, he said, Are you hungry? After that? Not particularly. Well, I'm starving. Let's go to town and grab some lunch. I'll tell you the story on the way, and then we can talk about what you want to do with this place. Despite what she'd just said, it had been hours since the lemon scone and coffee she'd bought at a charming bakery not far from her hotel. She needed to get out of the house, into the bright sunshine and fresh air, frigid as it was. She needed to shake off the fear that clung to her and think, I'll probably be hungry by the time we get there. I'll follow you. At the front door, he dug into his pocket and held out 2 keys. These are yours. I took the liberty of making a second. Maybe if I need to work and you're not home. He let the unspoken question hang there. She wasn't quite ready to let him keep a key to her place. "I'll leave it somewhere for you." He dropped both keys in her palm. "Fair enough." He opened the door. "I'll drive." "But you don't need to come back today. I gotta move that furniture and get a fire going for you. Until we get the furnace looked at, you'll want to be able to keep the place warm, right? I can stay in the hotel again tonight." "You can do that if you want, but I figured you'd prefer to save the money. Or," he stepped away, "or maybe you're nervous to be in the car with me, which I could understand. I mean, you barely know me." She laughed, the sound echoing off the tall ceiling. She stifled it quickly. "We went down to a creepy basement with hidden doors and a prison cell, and I survived. I think we're beyond all that." He smiled. "Then I'll drive and come back with you and get that furniture moved today, whether you want to stay here or not. That way, you'll have the option. Tomorrow, I can focus on putting together a plan. Fair enough?" When Aspen stepped into the Patriot, a homey restaurant in downtown Coventry, she could swear the room quieted, and every eye turned to her. Of course she was being paranoid. Garrett didn't seem to notice anything amiss, as he lifted his hand to wave at a man behind the lunch counter before he led her that direction. She was still feeling spooked after the tour, and Garrett's explanation in the car had only heightened the feeling. He'd told her about her renter and the woman and girl he'd planned to imprison in the house. Aspen's house. The thought was horrifying. As Garrett had promised, the story'd had a happy ending. She'd focus on that and not the rest. They reached the bar, and Garrett said, "Aspen Kincaid, meet James Sullivan." The man reached across the bar. "Nice to meet you." She yanked off her leather gloves and shook his hand. "James owns this restaurant," Garrett said, "and another business in town." "Just the one now," James said. "That's right. You no longer give backpacking tours." Garrett faced Aspen. Their new baby is crimping his style. She could swear James's chest expanded 2 sizes. "You're just jealous, man." He yanked out his phone, tapped the screen, and tilted it toward Aspen. "Would you want to leave them at home to take a bunch of strangers backpacking?" She studied the photo of the woman and child, a bald little blue-eyed infant girl. "They're both gorgeous," Aspen said. The man beamed. "I know. Hallie is perfect. Gets her looks from her mom." "Anyway," Garrett's voice was tinged with irritation and humor, "if you're done bragging about your family—" "Envy doesn't look good on you." He turned to Aspen. "I'm guessing you lost a bet if you're having lunch with this guy." She laughed while Garrett growled beside her, which only made James's smile spread. Garrett said, "She inherited that old house up on Rattlesnake Road." James's eyebrows hiked. "Does she know about—" "Just told her. She's new in town." "Oh, well, it's a great house. Beautiful views." "I'm excited about it," Aspen said, almost meaning it. "Do you care where we sit?" Garrett asked James. "Nope. You beat the lunch crowd. Grab a table and I'll send a server over." To Aspen, he said, "Nice to meet you." "You too." She followed Garrett to a table by the window, but he changed his mind and led her closer to the back. "Don't want to be seen with me?" He turned, grinning, and waited until she slid into the booth before sitting across from her. "It's chilly by the windows. I figured you'd be warmer back here." "How thoughtful." A woman set 2 menus on the table and took their drink orders. After she walked away, Aspen said, "Your friend seems nice." "He's a good guy. We met at church." He watched her as if gauging her reaction. "Maybe you'd like to come sometime?" Aspen hadn't missed a Sunday at her church in Kona since Dad's death. Some people let tragedy separate them from God. Not Aspen. She'd leaned into him in the last year, more desperate for her heavenly Father now that her earthly one was gone. "Which church?" "Coventry Bible Fellowship, modern worship, great pastor, in a 100-year-old building." "I would love that," she said. "I'll be there Sunday." He smiled, seeming genuinely pleased. "Great. I'll save you a seat, introduce you to some friends." Even though she wouldn't be staying, the thought of meeting people in town, of having friends here, even temporarily, appealed to her. The server returned to take their orders. Aspen hadn't looked at the menu and scanned it quickly before ordering soup and salad. Seafood platter and onion rings. Garrett handed over their menus. When she was gone, he said, "Now that you've seen the house, what do you think?" She was formulating an answer when an old man stopped beside their table and greeted Garrett with a handshake. His hair, what was left of it, was dark gray, his eyes brown and clear when he turned to her. Bart Bradley. He held out his age-spotted hand and she shook it. It was cold, but his grip was strong. She said, "Nice to meet you. I'm Aspen Kincaid." Without letting up his grip, the man studied her like one might a science experiment involving mold or bat feces. "You're Jane's daughter." Shock silenced her, but she managed a quick nod. "You look just like her." Bart's eyes narrowed. "She ever turn up?" It wasn't the words so much as the tone, not to mention the way he was glaring at her, that had Aspen's heartbeat racing. Before she could respond, Garrett said, "Not sure her life or her mother's are any of your business, Mr. Bradley." The old man finally let go of Aspen's hand. He turned to Garrett. "What do you know about it?" "I know you're not being very friendly to someone new to town," he said. "Either be polite or move along." This man had information about her mother, information she wanted, but she didn't have the courage to ask questions, not seeing the sheer hatred in his eyes. "Pardon my rudeness." He looked anything but sorry. "Your mother caused a lot of heartache. I just wondered—" "She disappeared when I was a baby," Aspen said. He glared, and she held his eye contact, refusing to back down, as if they were in some sort of battle of wills. Then he huffed and spun and stalked across the room. This wasn't about Aspen, it was about Jane. What had her mother done to garner such hatred? And why did Aspen suddenly think she'd prefer even the creepy basement to this public restaurant? In that low, soothing voice, Garrett said, "Sorry about that. He's a crusty old man. I don't know what it is that makes some old people shed their manners, not that Mr. Bradley ever had many to begin with. He's lived in town a long time, I guess. All his life, I think." Garrett seemed to be studying her now, and why not? He must not have known her connection to this town. He must be curious, but unlike Bart Bradley, he was too polite to ask. "I was born here, but I haven't lived here since I was a baby." "It's none of my business." "I guess Bart Bradley thinks it's his." The old man knew more about her mother than Aspen did. "You know what that was about?" Garrett asked. "Not really." She swallowed the grief and fear that rose in her throat. "But I need to find out."
Chapter 5. Garrett had witnessed Bart Bradley grousing and grumbling his way through life, but he'd never seen the man be outright rude. What in the world could Aspen's mother have done to elicit that much animosity? And so many years after the fact, he'd ask Uncle Dean. He and Aunt Deborah had been in town all their lives. Surely, if there was some scandal involving Aspen's family, they'd know about it. Except, he'd been right when he'd told Aspen it wasn't his business. He had no right to go behind her back or to encourage people to gossip about her family just to satisfy his own curiosity. He wouldn't. He'd do his job and make no effort to learn her secrets. If she wanted to tell him anything, he'd be a willing listener and an ally that, based on the confrontation with Bradley, she might need. He'd excused himself to use the restroom and was on his way back to the table when he caught sight of more than one person sneaking glances at Aspen. He could only see the back of her head, but she seemed to be looking down, maybe oblivious, maybe avoiding their ease. He glared at an older guy who attended his church and kept glaring until the man turned his way. He seemed embarrassed to have been caught staring. Aspen was beautiful, but he didn't see admiration in the guy's eyes. Curiosity, maybe, but also animosity. Why? Did she feel it in the room? Did she know? He slid into the booth across from her, and she glanced up from her phone. Her skin was pale, her countenance almost sad. "Everything okay?" She seemed to force a smile. "Sure, why wouldn't it be?" Should he mention what he'd seen? or let it go. The server delivered their meals, asked if they needed anything else, and then walked away. "Want me to say grace?" he asked. Her eyes brightened considerably. "That'd be nice." He squelched the desire to reach across the table and take her hand and bowed his head. He prayed not just for God to bless their food, but for him to lead both of them as they planned the renovations. And then, thinking of the people who were likely watching them, he prayed for Aspen's peace and protection. Though he had no idea what was going on, he figured she'd appreciate the first and feared she'd need the second. After his amen, she looked up with a shy smile. "Thank you." "Of course." He grabbed a fried scallop, dipped it in tartar sauce, and popped it in his mouth. After she tasted her meal, he said, "How is it?" "Delicious. Yours?" "Great. Do you want to try something?" "Oh, that's okay." He scooted his plate closer to her and pointed at the items. "Shrimp, scallops, cod, and onion rings. Help yourself." "I'm guessing you could eat all that by yourself, especially after all the shoveling this morning." "I don't mind sharing." She chose a scallop. "That's really good. Anything else you want to try?" "That's all right. I'll know what to order next time." And then her expression dimmed. "Maybe I'll get takeout." So she had noticed the people staring. He usually loved this little town, but at that moment, he felt like giving the whole room a piece of his mind. Rather than asking the questions hovering between them, he said, "You've seen the house. What do you think?" "It's in better shape than I thought it would be." Better shape? What had she expected? "What's your goal for the property?" She shrugged. "Fix it up and sell it." "Do you have a deadline?" She swallowed her spoonful of soup. "Not a specific date. And I assume that, if I decide to leave town, you could continue the renovations without me." "Of course. The time difference will make it harder, but we can figure it out. How many hours behind is Hawaii?" "I'm not going back to Hawaii. Not right away." "Oh, where are you going?" She shrugged. "I have grandparents in Florida, so I'm planning to go there." "I'm sure they'd like that." "I don't know them very well. We never visited them, and they only came to Hawaii a few times when I was growing up. But since they're the only family I keep in touch with." "You could stay here?" She laughed, the sound musical. The flash of amusement transformed her face. Wow, she was a looker. Not that he was interested. No sense getting involved with somebody who clearly had no desire to stick around. "I don't think I could get used to the weather," she said. "I'm a beach girl, a surfer and swimmer. What would I do here?" "I'm guessing that, if you can surf, you can ski. And the lakes are beautiful in the summer." "And cold." True. Why would she choose to live in the mountains in New Hampshire when she could go anywhere in the country? The world, really. He tamped down a surge of disappointment. He barely knew this woman. Why did he care where she lived? "What would you do in Florida?" "I've always wanted to get a college degree." "In what?" "Probably hospitality. I always thought I'd work for Dad, so I never really let myself think about what else I want to do." "That's a good job, though." "Working with my father was great, but dealing with tourists and servers and cooks and suppliers, it has its challenges." "What do you love?" She seemed to consider the question for a few moments. He ate a few bites of his lunch while she thought. "I've been volunteering at my church since I was in high school," she said, "and I love that. Working with the kids and mentoring teenagers. I used to help run an internship for teens and young adults, 16 to 22. It was an amazing program that pulled them into the church, made them feel a part of it. I'd love to do something like that for a job, but I wouldn't even know how to get started." "That sounds like a great dream," he said. "I used to think that God's will for me was probably something I'd hate. I've since learned that God gave me gifts and talents and dreams, not to torture me or discourage me, but to use in His kingdom. Not that remodeling people's houses is akin to mentoring young people in their faith, but it's important. You can serve God in whatever you do by glorifying Him and doing your best." He admired her faith, especially considering her situation. Most of the trials Garrett had faced had been the result of his own stupid choices, but hers, her mother missing almost all her life, losing her father, even now being judged by a bunch of strangers because of who her parents were. None of that was her fault, yet she seemed to face it all with faith and dignity. Impressive. He might have looked at her too long because she lowered her head and lifted her spoon. He wanted to ask her questions, to learn more about her. But when she said nothing else, he shifted back to the reason for their lunch. I assume you want to get as much money as you can out of the house. I guess. Do you need the cash from the sale right away? I have enough to live on for a while and I can support myself. I'll use the money for college, but I'm not starting until fall. I need to be there by May. Why, if school doesn't start until August? That gives me 3 full months to get a job, find a place to live, and buy everything I'll need to live there. I'll also need to find a church and hopefully get involved. I assume it's harder to judge churches in the summer, with so many people gone, so I'll need time to evaluate the different options. 3 months should do it. She'd put a lot of thought into that answer. He glanced at the notebook she'd barely looked up from since she'd first stepped into the house. What other plans had she laid out in that thing? If the renovation takes longer, though, he said, will it be a big deal? What would happen if you didn't make it to Florida until June? The plan is May, she said, as if that settled it. Why did it matter so much that she stick to her plan? More importantly, what difference did it make to him? What's your budget? I took out a home equity loan on the house. The lawyer here, Mr. Christensen, suggested I get the loan for $150,000, so that's what I did. Not that I want to spend that much, but I know renovations can be expensive. Do you think we can do it for that price? Depends on what you want to do, of course. I figure that, without more money, I won't be able to do more than just the cosmetic stuff we talked about today, especially if we have to replace the furnace. She flipped the notebook to a different page. I did some research before I left Hawaii. Based on that and what we saw today, I figure we can get by with the basics. She read off a list: floors, walls, countertops. And then there's the furnace. What will that cost? I'm guessing 10 to 20,000, right? 10 at the most, and that's assuming it can't be repaired. Oh, her eyes brightened. Really? He allowed a little chuckle. I have a feeling Hawaii is more expensive than New Hampshire. So this stuff on my list, what will that cost, and how long will it take? I have some things I need to do while I'm in Coventry, things related to my parents. Hopefully you can get it finished up while I'm here. What kinds of things? I mean, he shook his head quickly. I've been told I ask too many personal questions. She glanced past him toward the other diners. The place had filled for lunch, and he wondered if anybody else had noticed her. She pushed the notebook aside. As you already know, my parents have history here. My dad would never talk about what happened before my mother disappeared or why he left New Hampshire. But before he died, he said some things that made me think I might be able to get answers here. At the house, actually. I want to learn what I can, and once I do, I imagine I'll be ready to leave. She lowered her voice and leaned toward him. Considering the reception I'm getting, I don't feel exactly welcome. He hated that he couldn't disagree. You must look a lot like your mom. Yeah. The admission seemed troubling to her. I just hope looks are the only thing we have in common. He didn't ask the obvious question and was thankful when Aspen continued. Mom had some mental health problems, significant problems. That doesn't explain why people would treat you with animosity. There's a lot I don't understand. I hope to. And when I learn what I came to learn, I want to leave, move on with my life without all the unanswered questions and the glares from strangers. While he dreamed of creating a beautiful mountain retreat, all she wanted was to get answers about her parents and get out of town. But he didn't want her to miss out on what her house could be. And selfishly, he wanted to transform it, make it something he'd be proud to show off, something that would help him grow his business. He sent up a quick prayer for wisdom while he ate a few bites of his lunch. After a sip of water, he said, "How about I draw up 2 plans, one with the bare bones updates, the things on your list." He nodded to the notebook as if paying it respect. "And one that incorporates the ideas I mentioned this morning. Tomorrow we can get together, and you can decide what you want to do. I don't want you to waste your time. I'm really not open to doing anything too aggressive or time-consuming. I'm just getting started in this business. It'll be good practice for me. And maybe if he did his job well, he'd be able to convince her to do it his way." Back at the house, Garrett crouched beside Aspen in front of the fireplace. The temperature had dropped outside, and the living room was chilly even to him. Hopefully, this would keep it warm until he could get the furnace serviced. It's not that different from starting a fire outside. He'd stopped on the way to buy a couple of newspapers and now ripped one section into long strips. You need something that will light easily. I've always used newspaper. Some people buy kindling, but there are enough twigs and brush in the woods that I've never seen the need. He covered the rack with paper, then added some kindling he'd brought in when he'd delivered the wood. He added the smallest split logs from the pile. She turned to him, a slight smile on her face. "This part I get," she said. "I have made my share of fires." "Sorry, I don't mean to, what do they call it? Mansplain?" She chuckled. "I get the feeling you're going to be explaining a lot of things to me before our work together is finished. Considering I know nothing about living in a place like this, or about renovations for that matter, I'll try hard not to be offended if you'll try hard not to laugh at my ignorance." "I'm not making that promise." He turned her way and winked. "Laughing is good for the soul. In that case, I'll do my best to amuse you." "I don't think you'll have to try that hard." He nudged her shoulder with his, immediately regretting the familiar gesture. She was his client. He needed to keep that in mind. But he felt a weird kinship with her, as if they'd known each other for years, not hours. She was beautiful, but it wasn't that. There was a connection there. And after Bradley's attack, Garrett had wanted to protect her. Still did, now that he thought about it. Which maybe explained why he was crouched on the floor building her a fire. Definitely not a normal part of his general contracting duties. He showed her how to open the flue, then heat up the chimney so the cold air wouldn't sink. Then he lit the paper. The fire blazed to life. They watched it for a few minutes. He grabbed the poker from the fireplace tools, left by some past occupant, and adjusted the logs to help them burn. When they'd caught and he was certain they weren't about to go out, he put the fireplace screen back where it belonged. He stood and brushed off his hands. "The wood here," he nodded to the pile he'd left on the hearth, "ought to last you all night. Do you want me to bring you a rick of split wood tomorrow?" Another one of his winter income sources. "Is that a lot?" "More than enough to last you a month or so." "If you could, that'd be great." He told her how much it would cost, and she laughed. A small price to pay to not freeze to death. How could she seem so happy? She should be jet-lagged, grieving, and frustrated at the rude customers at the Patriot, not to mention creeped out by the history of her house. Instead, she was smiling and laughing as if all were well in the world. Her smile faded. "So, anyway," he'd been staring. "Yeah, my friends should be here any minute." He'd called Reed, Thomas, and Fitz from the car while Aspen was in the hotel, gathering her things and checking out. Fitz, a police detective in Plymouth, was on duty, but Reed worked from home and Thomas was off. They both said they'd be happy to help. "I'm glad you decided to stay here. No sense staying in town when you have this big place all to yourself." She shuddered. "I'd be more comfortable in town than in this big secluded place, but I'd rather not spend the money on the hotel if I can help it. Since there's furniture and something that sort of passes for heat," he chuckled. "You'll be warm enough. I'll take your suitcase upstairs." "Thanks, I'll put away the groceries." When they'd left the hotel, she'd said she'd go back to town later to buy what she needed. But he swung by the little store so she wouldn't have to. It was supposed to snow that evening, and he didn't want her driving in it just to pick up dinner. Come to think of it, "I bet I can find you a kitchen table. Nothing fancy, but at least you could sit to eat. Don't go to any trouble." "Are you planning to buy furniture?" She gazed around the empty space. "I'll need to. I'll see what I can do." By the time he'd carried her suitcases upstairs, his friends were at the door. He let them in and introduced them to Aspen. Reed was tall and fit, and some might say handsome, but he was happily married. Thomas, on the other hand, was a bachelor. Successful and confident and charming, not to mention good-looking, the guy volunteered for the fire department and search and rescue. He kept himself physically fit as if those were his day jobs. Everybody in town liked Thomas. He eyed Aspen a little too closely and with a little too much admiration. The feeling that rose in Garrett was so unfamiliar, he almost didn't recognize what it was. Possessiveness. Idiotic, considering he had no claim on her at all. Still, as Aspen chatted with Thomas, Garrett barely resisted the urge to tell his friend that she was off limits. When Garrett forced himself to quit staring at the two of them, he saw that Reed was watching him, a little too much amusement in his eyes. He ignored his friend. "Let's get to work so we can get out of Aspen's hair." "Right behind you," Thomas said. To Aspen, he added, "Be right back." Before she responded, Garrett snapped, "Let's go," and stalked to the basement door. Together, the three of them carried one of the twin beds and mattress. She insisted she didn't need both, to the master bedroom. They also took up the nightstand and the bureau. She'd put the bedding in the wash, and Garrett almost asked her if she'd like him to stay until it was finished. Knowing what had happened in the basement, he hated to think of her down there by herself. But this was her house, and she was an adult. She didn't seem like the type of woman to run scared from a creepy basement. In the junk room on the second floor, that was what he'd been calling the bedroom where he'd stored everything he'd found. He and his buddies located some pots and pans and plates, utensils and glasses and cups, and brought them to the kitchen. "That ought to tide you over," Garrett said, setting the items on the counter. She looked up from where she was scouring the kitchen sink. "Those are perfect. Thank you." Her gaze moved to Reed and Thomas. "I can't thank you enough for helping me out." "A friend of Garrett's is a friend of ours," Thomas said. Garrett managed to not glare at him. Reed said, "I hope you'll join us at church Sunday. I'm sure my wife would like to meet you." "I'll be there. I'm looking forward to it." "You need anything else?" Garrett asked. She scanned the kitchen. "Nope. Thanks to you, I'm good for now. If you think of anything, don't hesitate to call. Otherwise, I'll get back to you when I have those plans drawn up. Probably tomorrow morning." She walked them to the door, they said their goodbyes, and Garrett reluctantly followed his friends out. In the driveway, Garrett said, "Thanks for your help. Now she'll be able to stay here instead of the hotel." "It's nice to get out of the house," Reed glanced at his watch. "But I need to get back to town. It's almost time to pick up Ella from dance." As Reed opened the door of his SUV, Thomas glanced at the house. "So you two, we just met." Garrett hoped his words sounded casual, even if he felt something completely different. Thomas turned to him. "I get it, man. I'll keep my distance." "What? I didn't say—" "Your feelings are so obvious, they might as well be tattooed on your face." "I have no feelings for her." None that made sense anyway. "And besides, she's only staying temporarily." Thomas glanced at Reed, who tapped his watch. "So was Jackie. Oh, and Carly." Thomas referred to Reed's and Braden's wives. "And even Grace." "You'd better go," Garrett said. "Reed'll kill you if he's late picking up his daughter." Thomas chuckled. "Just saying." He rounded Reed's car and climbed in. When Garrett was alone in the driveway, he glanced at Aspen's front door. She'd be fine by herself. She had food, she had heat. Still, as he walked to his pickup, thinking of the looks from the customers and Bart Bradley's comments at lunch, he lifted a prayer for her safety and protection. Chapter 6. It was dark by the time Garrett turned down the long tree-lined driveway to his aunt and uncle's house, the place where Garrett lived from when he was 14 through college. His uncle had texted while Garrett was at Aspen's, but he hadn't gotten the notification until he was a few miles down the mountain. Aspen didn't have cell phone service at the house. He'd forgotten that. That was a problem that needed to be solved soon. Garrett's uncle had asked him to stop by on his way home. Even though Garrett had bought a condo years back, when he thought of home, he thought of this little split level in the woods. As he parked his truck, Aunt Deborah pushed open the front door. She was still dressed for work in slacks, a purple blouse, and a black jacket. She'd put on weight over the years and was constantly talking about going on a diet. Not doing it, but talking about it. As far as he was concerned, she didn't need to. She was as healthy and pretty as ever. She dyed her hair a tad lighter every year, and now what used to be dark brown was fully blonde. She looked younger than her 50-something age. He'd just reached the walk when she said, "Hurry up before you let all the cold air in." He bounded up the concrete steps to the door, stepped inside, and kissed her cheek. "You could just leave the door shut until I get here." She squeezed his cold fingers. "Too eager to see you, kid." 35 years old, and she still called him kid. From the top of the half-flight of stairs, Uncle Dean said, "What do you want to drink with dinner?" "You don't need to feed me." but Garrett picked up the scents of ground beef and onions. On the other hand, Salisbury steak, with mashed potatoes and gravy. Uncle Dean was the cook in the family, always had been. Aunt Deborah rarely got out of work before 6, while Dean was a carpenter and worked from home. The bottom floor had been his workshop as long as Garrett could remember. "You know that's my favorite," Garrett said. Uncle Dean's smile softened the hard lines of his face. Unlike his wife, he wasn't wearing his work clothes. He ended most days covered in sawdust and sweat, so his first task after he closed up shop was to shower. Now he wore a pair of gray jogging pants and a black sweatshirt. He'd lost much of his hair, and what was left was starting to turn gray. He peered through his wire-rimmed bifocals. "If I remember correctly, anything with beef is your favorite." "Good point." Garrett gestured for Aunt Deborah to precede him, then followed her up the 6 steps to the main floor. There used to be 3 small rooms at the top of the stairs: living, dining, and kitchen. But years before, Dean and Garrett had remodeled it, making it one great room. They'd even removed the low ceiling and covered the rafters above with drywall to create a vaulted ceiling. The skylight was Garrett's favorite part of the new space. It had been a huge undertaking, and he'd loved every minute of it. That was when he'd decided he wanted to be a general contractor, to restore dingy, ugly, and aged spaces and make them beautiful again. Sort of like what God had done in his heart when he'd trusted in Christ, and like Dean and Deborah had done when they'd taken him in. Dean patted him on the back. "Coke? Or we got some of those fruity, bubbly things you like. Some weird flavor." "Tangerine," Deborah supplied. "I'll get it. You have a seat." They were always like this, treating him like an honored guest, as if he'd done them a favor by coming by, as if he didn't owe them everything. Over dinner, they chatted and caught up. Deborah usually had an anecdote about the patrons and fellow employees at the library where she worked. The stories were amusing at the least, often downright hilarious. As usual, the 3 of them laughed their way through the meal. When Garrett had eaten more than he should have, he started clearing the dishes. "The least I can do." Deborah settled back in her chair. "Not that I did anything but comment on the gravy, but I'll let you." "You bought the groceries," Dean said to her, "and worked all day." She shrugged. "Not as hard as Garrett, I'm sure, but he's young and strong." "My day was easy," Garrett said. "Met my new client and got her settled at the house." "How is the place?" Deborah asked. "Could be worse. Furnace is barely keeping up, but the fireplace will keep it warm. Do you 2 still have that old kitchen table in the garage? The little one with the sides that fold down?" "I think so," Deborah turned to Dean. "It's behind a bunch of stuff, but it's there. Would you mind letting her borrow it? Except in the bedroom, she has no furniture." "Sure," Dean said. "She can keep it." "And don't we still have those old chairs?" Deborah asked. "You were going to refinish them?" "Right. They're ugly as sin, but she can have them. We'll load them up before you leave." "You 2 are so generous. I'm sure she'll appreciate it." After Garrett finished the dishes, he and his uncle loaded the furniture in his truck, and Deborah excused herself to her room. Dean seemed ready to tell Garrett why he'd asked him to stop by. He cleared his throat and nodded to the living area. "I heard you had lunch with your client today. The Kincaid girl, right?" "Girl?" Garrett slid onto the soft cushions that had been his spot since he was a teen. "She's in her 20s. Dean set his glass of water on the table beside his recliner, sat and lifted the footrest. "She's 31. Surprised by the detail, Garrett let his expression ask the question. "I knew her mom pretty well." Garrett had decided he wasn't going to drill his uncle for details about Aspen, but it seemed he was going to get some anyway. "It's a long story," Dean said, "and not a particularly pretty one. Her mother, she was a little," he tapped the side of his head, "mentally ill. Probably more than a little. Not that we realized that. She seemed perfectly normal when we first met her. But the older she got..." When he didn't finish the thought, Garrett asked, "How did you meet her?" "Their family moved here Jane's senior year. She graduated and went to Plymouth State, where your aunt and I went. I got to know her through Deborah, and even more when Jane started dating a friend of mine." "You were friends with Aspen's father?" No, it was someone else." "So this was before Aspen was born." Though Garrett's statement had seemed both obvious and innocuous, Dean didn't confirm it. Jane was passionate and charismatic. She had some pretty strong beliefs. About? The environment. Loved the forest, loved trees. I mean, she named her kid Aspen for crying out loud. That's how much she loved trees. Nothing wrong with that, Garrett said. In New Hampshire, trees are the canvas of our lives. Dean's eyebrows lifted. Thank you, Robert Frost. I'm just saying, you'd be pretty miserable if you lived in this state and didn't like trees. I mean, except when the leaves fall. Only an idiot likes that. Gosh, how you used to complain when I made you rake. Garrett gestured to the picture window. Do you know how many trees you have out there? Why do you think we took you in? I haven't raked since? Garrett chuckled. He used to hate the annual project, but as he got older and grew more and more to appreciate his aunt and uncle, he went out of his way to get the leaves taken care of for them and manage a lot of the other more difficult chores around the house. It was the least he could do. I was a pain in the rear. You were a kid, Dean said. A normal kid. Far from normal considering the trouble he'd gotten into before he'd moved in with Dean and Deborah. Dean continued. Aspen's mother was obsessed with saving the trees. All the trees. Ah. Lumber was one of the biggest industries in New Hampshire. He imagined a lone woman carrying a sign and protesting the billion-dollar industry. If she'd become a lawyer or gone into politics, perhaps she could have gotten legislation that changed the way the industry worked, but she didn't want to change it. She wanted to do away with it. She had a following, a bunch of fellow college students who practically worshipped her. Obviously, they had no real impact. More Don Quixote versus windmills than David versus Goliath. Exactly, but Jane was determined, and like I said, again he tapped his head, not entirely sane. She'd discovered one company that she was convinced was destroying the earth, and when they refused to bow to her demands, she had demands? That they stop murdering the trees. Very rational. In her defense, there are rules to protect the forest, and this company was not following them and covering it up. But Jane was fierce. She did her homework. She became obsessed with proving their neglect. Did she? Yup. And they received a slap on the wrist and a fine and kept on going. Business as usual. Though by all accounts they started obeying the rules, so she did have an impact, albeit a small one. But it wasn't what she wanted. She'd hoped they'd be put out of business, and when they weren't, it pushed her over the edge. Dean lowered the footrest on his recliner, leaned forward, and propped his elbows on his knees. In that moment, he looked older than his years. His wrinkles more pronounced, his skin nearly gray. Was his uncle healthy? Surely if he wasn't, he or Deborah would tell Garrett. He couldn't imagine losing this man, who was more of a father than his own had ever been. Uncle, are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine, just... He blew out a long breath and sat back. Look, I don't want to get into everything that happened back then. You don't have to. Dean obviously needed to rest, and the last thing Garrett wanted was to add stress to his uncle's life. He'd done enough of that as a kid. Dean rested his head against the headrest. Like I said, it was an ugly story, and it brings back a lot of painful memories. Garrett didn't understand, but as he'd reminded himself earlier, Aspen's family history was none of his business. We don't have to talk about it. Your client's mother disappeared under a cloud of suspicion. What was she suspected of? He shook his head at the question. The point is, people got hurt. Aspen isn't her mother. True, but a lot of people want to know what happened to Jane Kincaid. You think she's dead, right? Dean's eyebrows lifted. Why do you say that? You've only referred to her in the past tense. Yeah, I think she's dead. Why? I can't imagine a woman like her staying hidden for long. What do you mean, like her? Beautiful, charismatic, radical, and insane. Those characteristics don't exactly fly under the radar. If she were still alive, she'd have turned up by now. Garrett lowered his head. Poor Aspen. No wonder her father had taken her away from New Hampshire. Except he'd bought a house here. Why? What good could possibly come of Aspen learning this ugly story about her mother? Though how could her dad have known he'd die so young? Maybe he'd never thought Aspen would find out about the house. But why buy it in the first place? Unless someone's been keeping her hidden. Dean's words had Garrett's gaze snapping up. What do you mean? Who? I need you to do something. Aside from household chores, Dean never asked Garrett for favors. The thought of being able to repay, even in some small measure, what Dean and Deborah had done for him. Anything. You know that. I need you to keep an eye on Jane's daughter. I need to know if she says anything about her mother or what happened back then. Let me know where she goes and who she talks to. Maybe ask some questions. See if you can get her to talk about what she's doing. Garrett sat back, stunned. You want me to spy on Aspen? On my client? Not spy, son. Just listen and watch and let me know what you learn, that's all. If she has any idea where her mother is or what happened to her, there are people in this town who need to know. Why? What is it to any of them? It's possible Jane Kincaid was responsible for a woman's death. If she's still alive? Wait, you think she killed someone? Not exactly. Dean heaved a deep breath and blew it out. When he lifted his glass of water, his hand was shaking. Worry almost had Garrett asking again about Dean's health, but he stopped himself. He would honor his uncle's privacy. It's okay, Garrett said. We can talk. If her husband's been protecting Jane all these years, maybe he hid her somewhere. Maybe he had her committed. Garrett was shaking his head before his uncle stopped talking. Aspen has no idea where her mother is. She said as much to Bart Bradley. If she knows anything about what happened back then, she wouldn't tell Bart. Dean set the glass back on the table, nearly tipping it in the process. It's not like I'm asking you to betray a friend. You just met her. She's only a client. You're her contractor, not her attorney. Garrett swallowed hard. Aspen was only a client, despite how attracted he was to her. That doesn't change anything. I'm the only person she knows in town. And she trusted him. How could he do what Dean was asking? But how could he not? So, if you're right and the girl knows nothing about her mother's whereabouts, Dean said, then you'll have nothing to report to me. But if you're wrong, you can't be serious. I mean, how old was Aspen when this happened? She's an adult now. Even if she knows what happened back then, and how would she unless someone told her? We're talking about her mother. I know where her loyalties lie, and I get that she might not know anything. The thing is, son, there are people in town who need to know what she knows. It'll be much easier if you find out on the sly than if somebody else, somebody less patient and more invested than you, confronts her directly. Who? People. People whose lives were destroyed because of Jane. Destroyed? What happened back then? Everything in him wanted to press his uncle for answers. Deborah stepped into the room. Sorry to interrupt. She smiled at Garrett, then glanced at Dean. When she did, her eyes popped wide, and she hurried to him. Are you all right? Do you need anything? He shook his head but didn't speak. What is happening? Garrett stood and looked from his aunt to his uncle. What's going on? Dean waved off the question. It's fine. I just get... But he huffed as if he'd just run a race. That's it, Deborah said. I'm making you an appointment tomorrow. To Garrett, she said, he's been having these episodes where he can't seem to catch his breath. Suddenly, Garrett felt the same way. What is it? Dean sat back in his recliner and inhaled deeply, then blew the air out. We'll figure it out, Deborah said. As soon as we know, we'll tell you. Garrett gripped her forearm. Is that a promise? She glanced at Dean, who said nothing, and turned back to him. It's a promise. Dean took Deborah's other hand. We're almost done. Her lips were pressed closed, but she kissed his cheek and hugged Garrett. Come back soon. She lowered her voice to a whisper. 2 more minutes, okay? He nodded, and she grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and returned to her bedroom. Garrett sat on the edge of the sofa. How long has this been going on? Dean's color was returning. He glanced at the hallway entrance. She's overreacting. I'm sure it's nothing. You're going to the doctor. You're not going to get all stubborn and stupid on me, right? The older man smiled. When have I ever... I can make a list. Dean chuckled, but the sound died fast. What I need is for you to do this for me. And don't tell her we had this conversation or anything about me. How could Garrett do this to her? If she knows what her mother did or where she is, Dean said, just let me know. If she doesn't know anything, then there'll be nothing to report. Dean was right. If Aspen knew nothing, and he suspected that was the case. Then what would it hurt to report that to Dean? Garrett could put his mind at ease. In fact, he could be doing Aspen a favor by convincing Dean, who could convince others in town. She knew nothing about her mother's whereabouts or complicated history. He could be protecting her. And anyway, how could he refuse his uncle? This could be good for Aspen. As long as she never found out what he was up to, everything would be fine. Chapter 7. 30 years ago, the planner was the first to enter the seedy bar off the interstate. Early, of course. He ordered a beer and found a table in the back corner, where he sipped and he studied his notes while he waited. After a few minutes, two more people stepped into the dark interior. They paused to let their eyes adjust to the light and then made their way to where he sat at a round table in the far back corner. All three were students, which anybody who cared to look would guess. He himself had a notebook. The second wore a sweatshirt emblazoned with the college's logo, which earned a glare from him. Everything about the third, from the glasses to the leather messenger bag, screamed intellectual. But the bar was mostly empty, and the bartender was too busy flirting with her customers to pay any attention to them. Once they were all seated at the table, the planner started the meeting. He directed the conversation, never using the others' names. He called them the Crusader and the Builder. They were all integral to the operation, of course, but it was the planner who would make it happen and keep them all out of prison. He focused on the Builder. "You're sure you can do it?" "No question." "And the supplies?" "It'll take time. I'll need to go on a few day trips. Make sure I buy everything out of state." He turned to the Crusader. "And the target?" "You know who it has to be." As usual, her voice was too loud, earning a vehement shush from the Builder. The Crusader lowered her volume and leaned in. "They got a slap on the wrist, barely a hiccup in their operation. We have to make them pay." The planner didn't know if that was true, but the idea of what they were going to do filled him with a heady sense of power. He'd gotten away with everything he'd ever done. Thanks to his parents' positions and money, nobody'd ever looked twice at him for the petty crimes he'd committed. He'd been labeled a good kid early on, and everybody believed it. He was good still. This plan wouldn't benefit those doing it, but it would benefit the world. It was worth the risk. Not that he planned for any of them to go to prison. He'd mitigate all the risks. The lumber company would pay, and the three of them would walk away without so much as a blemish on their records. It would just take very careful planning.
Chapter 8. As soon as the sheets were clean that evening, Aspen lay down for a short nap and ended up sleeping for almost 3 hours. She woke up starving. She stoked the fire, fixed herself dinner, which she ate on the floor in front of the hearth, and then settled onto her bed to read a few chapters of her novel. But the chill in the air and the strange creaks and groans of the old house kept pulling her focus from the book. She'd never lived so far from civilization. Except for the last year, she'd never lived alone. At various times over the years, she'd thought about getting her own place, but she and her father had gotten along so well. And with the rent prices in Hawaii, it was either live with him or live with roommates. Even after Dad's death, surrounded by neighbors she'd known for years, she'd hardly felt abandoned. Back in Kona, all she had to do was step out her front door, and she'd almost always see a friendly face. The novel failed to hold her attention, so she thought she'd watch an old sitcom on the tiny screen of her phone, hoping the familiar voices might lull her to sleep, but she had no service. When she couldn't sleep in Hawaii, she went for a walk. The evening air, scented by the sea and the flowers that bloomed everywhere, never ceased to relax her. But she wasn't in Hawaii anymore. She was creeped out. Being in this strange, wintry world, so far from everything, had her nerves on edge. She needed to find a way to feel comfortable in this place if she was ever going to sleep. She wished she could settle in front of the fire downstairs where it was warm, but the hardwood floor wasn't exactly cozy. Tomorrow she was going to get furniture and deal with the internet and phone issues, and she'd buy a TV, if for nothing other than noise. Could she get cable up here? Wi-Fi? Why hadn't she managed any of that rather than taking a 3-hour nap? Stupid jet lag had her system all out of whack. She added those tasks to her to-do list, then closed her eyes. But lying on the bed was doing her no good. After dressing quickly, she moved into the walkway, thankful for the overhead lights, which she flipped on along the way. Downstairs, she stoked the fire and added another log. She figured she'd want it roaring when she got back. Then she put on her new boots and coat, slipped on the nearly useless leather gloves, and trudged to the back of the house. She could do this. She could face this scary, secluded world. She could survive here. When she opened the door, a blast of cold air almost had her changing her mind. But, wow. She stepped onto the deck and closed the door behind herself. The clouds had moved out, and the moon was full, its light bouncing off the fresh snow that had fallen that evening, which covered the ground and the trees, making the world much brighter than it ought to be at nearly midnight. Millions of stars twinkled overhead. She picked out a few constellations, and the familiarity was comforting. The world seemed so different, but the moon had come with her. The stars had come with her. The Lord had come with her. She wasn't alone. The scent of wood smoke filled the air, comforting. And then the silence hit her. Had she ever experienced such silence? There was always noise in Kona, the whir of traffic, the conversations of locals and tourists, the chirps and calls of birds. At night, when everything else was quiet, she could pick up the sound of the surf against the rocks not far from her apartment. But here, she heard nothing. She couldn't decide if it was peaceful or terrifying. Maybe both. After carefully maneuvering down the snow-covered steps, she wandered across the backyard, her backyard, and stepped into the woods. She couldn't go far, though. The trees and brush were thick, and she feared falling and breaking an ankle. She'd freeze to death before anybody found her. She turned back to the yard and walked the perimeter, spying a narrow path that led into the woods near the detached garage. She took a few steps down it, then thought better of venturing into the unknown in the middle of the night. On the other hand, this wasn't going to be much of a walk if she was afraid to leave her yard. Why did she feel so nervous? After Garrett and his friends left, she hadn't heard a single car drive by. She was safe, and though she might have felt differently, she reminded herself that she wasn't alone. God was at her side. That thought gave her courage to venture around the house. Halfway there, she heard something and paused to listen. It was the sound of a car engine coming closer. She was nearly to the corner of the house when she saw headlight beams shine on the narrow road coming from town. She'd thought the car had been coming quickly, but it seemed to slow. Before the vehicle came into view, its headlights quit bouncing. Then they went off entirely. She could hear the vehicle idling on the far side of the thick forest, but all she could see was moonlight glinting off metal. Sedan, SUV, pickup. She couldn't tell. Somebody was watching the house, and the last thing she wanted was to alert that person that she was all alone outside, completely vulnerable. She dared not move. She had no way to call for help. 2 minutes passed. 3. Though her hands were shoved deep in the pockets of her jacket, her fingers ached with cold. Her teeth chattered. Her heart raced. When the car made no move, she inched away slowly. So slowly. Finally, she reached the back corner of her house and bolted across the yard, up the back steps, and inside. She locked the door behind her. After she shed her coat and boots, she crossed into the living room and peeked through the blinds and out the front window. The watcher was gone. Aspen was still in bed the next morning, barely awake, when the doorbell rang. She checked the time on her phone, nearly 10 o'clock. She never slept that late in Kona. Of course, in Kona, she didn't have creepy people stalking her in the middle of the night. She threw on a pair of jeans, an old sweatshirt, and some socks, then hurried down the stairs, where she opened the blinds. She couldn't see the front step, but Garrett's truck was parked in the driveway. When she opened the door, she barely caught his smile before it morphed into a frown. "Did I wake you?" He shook his head. "I mean, not that you should have been awake already. You can sleep as long as you want." He pressed his lips closed and quelled the babbling. She caught sight of 2 steaming cups in his hands and prayed they held coffee. She'd brought her grinder and French press from home, not to mention a bag of beans, but she didn't want to wait for the kettle to boil. Come to think of it, she didn't have a kettle. Considering the look Garrett was giving her, she should have spent a little more time getting ready before rushing downstairs. She stepped back and held the door open. Just give me 5 minutes. Leaving him in the living room, she washed her face and brushed her teeth and hair, then found her fluffy slippers. Downstairs, Garrett was trying to maneuver an old wooden ladderback chair into her house. Here, let me help. She held open the storm door, and he carried the chair through to the dining area. She followed and discovered he'd brought another chair and a small table. Where'd these come from? My aunt and uncle. He arranged the 3 pieces in front of the tiny window. My uncle's always collecting furniture to refinish, but he never gets to it. They said you could have these. They're not much, but at least you can sit to eat. How kind of them. Tell them I said thank you. He nodded and handed her the cup. I thought maybe it'd be too late for coffee, but I guess. She took a long, grateful sip. It wasn't Kona coffee, but it was good. This is exactly what I needed, thank you. Did you sleep all right? Not exactly. Any chance you drove up here last night to check on me? He squinted, and his head tilted to the side. No. Should I have? She sat in one of the chairs. It felt solid, but the once white paint was peeling off the seat. The table was a dull brown, but it seemed sturdy and solid. She took another sip, wishing she didn't have to burden her contractor with this. But who else did she have? He sat in the other chair. Did something happen? I couldn't sleep. She told him about her walk and the vehicle she'd seen. By the time she was finished with the story, his lips were pressed together. Somebody was watching the house? I thought so at the time, but maybe, I don't know. Maybe people come up here to look at the stars or something? Or maybe, are there any other houses on this road? Summer homes for tourists farther up. There was something in the set of his mouth, the lowered eyebrows, that made her think he was angry. I'm probably just being paranoid. There are miles of road between here and town. Whoever was driving that car, if they wanted to look at stars or peer into the woods or make out, if it was a couple of kids, they could have done it anywhere along the road. They stopped here for a reason. So you think? Exactly what you think. He stood and ran a hand over his head, then swiveled to face her. First, Bart Bradley and all those glares at the restaurant. He'd seen that? She hadn't thought. And then, he swallowed hard, shaking his head. Now your house is being watched. What's going on here, Aspen? I don't know. Had her voice shaken? She'd lain awake for hours, terrified, not falling asleep until the world outside her window started to brighten. At some point, she'd convinced herself that she'd overreacted. It seemed Garrett disagreed. You have no idea? I've never been here before. This is your town. I don't know these people. They seem to think they know you, though. He sat and studied her. He wore a dark gray chamois button-down that looked warm and soft, so unlike the glare he was giving her. Are you angry about something? You came to fix up this house and sell it, he said. And what else did you say? Do something that has to do with your parents? What exactly? How is this your business? It's not. He dropped his head back and stared at the ceiling, taking a deep breath. I'm not angry with you. He pushed back the chair and stepped through the door into the kitchen. He returned a moment later and set a backpack on the table. I drew up the plans we talked about. Do you want to look at them now? The change of subject had her reeling. It was too early in the morning for this. Well, not early exactly. I guess, she said. After another long moment of him watching her, he said, Why don't you get something to eat? Try to wake up a little. He was right. Food would help. You want anything? I'm good. In the kitchen, she put an English muffin in the broiler. While it cooked, she scrambled herself an egg, then buttered the muffin, put the egg on top, and added a slice of cheese. She returned to the dining room with her breakfast sandwich to find Garrett had opened a laptop. While she ate her breakfast, he focused on the screen. Neither of them spoke. She missed the easy camaraderie they'd shared the previous day. For reasons she didn't understand, someone had driven halfway up the mountain in the middle of the night to watch her house. And Garrett seemed to blame her for that. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. She barely tasted the breakfast, but the calories kicked her brain into gear. Who cared what Garrett thought of her? He needed to get her house prepared to sell, and he didn't have to like her to do that. She'd worked in restaurant management long enough to learn that people didn't have to like her to work for her. In fact, sometimes it was easier when they didn't. She finished the sandwich, carried the plate into the kitchen, and returned to the table. "Look." "I'm sorry." They'd spoken at the same time. She sat and nodded for him to continue. He blew out a long breath. "I'm not being very nice." She knocked on the table. "You brought me furniture." The tiny smile transformed his face from good-looking to gorgeous. She was sorry when it faded. "I'm just worried, that's all. Trying to figure out what's going on. But seeing as how I know absolutely nothing, it's frustrating. I'm as much in the dark as you are." "Are you?" When she didn't respond, he said, "I think you'd be safer back at the hotel." Maybe, but Dad had bought this house for a reason. She assumed that reason had something to do with the reception she'd gotten in town the day before, and her middle-of-the-night visitor. She also assumed this house was the key to finding her mother. If she left it empty, would its secrets be safe? Or was somebody else also looking to uncover those secrets? Maybe Aspen's presence had opened the proverbial can of worms, and now everybody in town knew that the worms were hidden somewhere on this property. If that even made sense. "I'm sorry I encouraged you to stay here last night," Garrett said. "You need to go back to the hotel. I'll wait while you gather your things and—" "No," terrified as she was to stay. "I'm not leaving." His smile seemed forced. "It's not going to be a problem. Even if we were to do all the renovations I want, it won't cost you $150,000, and you'll get plenty of money out of this house. You can afford to stay in the hotel, or why don't you find a rental property? I have a friend who owns condos in the community where I live. I could ask him. It's not about the money. I need to stay here." "That's insane. Why would you—" "I am not insane." Her heart raced at the word, and she pushed to her feet. "Look, I don't know who you think you are to come in here and tell me what I should do. Just because you don't understand my reasons doesn't mean I don't have good ones." His hands went up, palms out. "I didn't mean—" "My life is none of your business." Both his arms dropped, his shoulders along with them. "You're right." Silence settled between them, but she wasn't about to break it. The nerve. After a staring contest, his pale blue eyes were enchanting, so it really was no chore. He blinked. "Are those reasons really worth the risk if somebody's stalking you?" It was a fair question, and she considered it as she took her seat again. Was it worth the risk? To do what her father had asked? To find her mother? To find the answers to questions she'd been asking all her life? She closed her eyes and prayed. Most of her days began with prayer and Bible reading. Not that she hadn't done a lot of both the night before, when she'd feared the stranger outside. But having missed her time with God that morning, she felt off her game. "I need you, Lord. Give me wisdom. Am I being foolish? Am I like my mother? Am I crazy?" She'd spent years praying she wasn't like her mother, watching for signs of her own insanity. Was this one? But God's peace settled into her heart. God had been with her throughout this journey, and he was with her now. She opened her eyes to find Garrett watching her closely. "It is worth the risk. I know that doesn't make sense to you, and I can't explain it." She expected him to ask her what she was up to, what she hoped to gain by staying there. Maybe she should tell him, but she wasn't ready to share her plans. Fortunately, he only nodded. Aspen liked that he didn't pry. "I'm not crazy," she reiterated. "I don't want to stay here without some protection. Will you help me?" For the first time since he'd stood on her front porch with 2 cups of coffee, he gave her a genuine smile. "What did you have in mind?" "An alarm system, for one, but without a landline." "As it happens," Garrett said, "I remembered last night that you don't have cell service. You can cancel the appointment, but—" "Wait, appointment?" They're going to install phones. I made some assumptions about what you'd want. He shifted in his chair, seeming nervous. I should have asked you, but I didn't want to come back that late, and if we hadn't called until today, they probably wouldn't get out here until tomorrow. Or even Monday. I know a guy at the phone company, old friend from school. I did a little cajoling, and he's gonna come out around 4. Along with the landline, I got you their best internet service. The price difference between that and the next one down is negligible. And TV service. You won't get any reception up here without it. You can change or eliminate anything, but my friend told me to order everything so the tech would have the equipment in his truck, whatever you decide. Garrett took a piece of paper from his breast pocket and slid it across the table. You can call from town if you want to change the appointment. A phone, internet, and cable. Garrett had taken care of that for her. That was... Her eyes stung. She blamed fatigue and maybe relief. Thank you so much. He shrugged it off and glanced at his watch. If we head to town soon, I can get an alarm system installed before they arrive, and then we can hook it up so the police will be alerted if anyone tries to break in. I have my own errands to run and my own car. I don't need to go with you. I'm not leaving you alone here, if that's what you're thinking. Do you own a gun? No. She wasn't sure what to respond to first. His thinking he could tell her what to do, or that crazy question about the gun. She decided to ignore the first and deal with the second. Do you? Several handguns, a few hunting rifles, and a shotgun. I'll bring you one. Handgun, that is. His lips twitched as if the idea of her having a shotgun were humorous. As if the rest weren't. She was still processing. You own several guns? I'll teach you how to use it. You need to be able to defend yourself. It's not that I'm against guns, but... Let's hope not, all things considered. The locks on this place have all been updated, and the windows are nailed shut. But there's no... Nailed shut? Why? The guy who lived here before... Oh, right. He'd made the house into a prison. This was getting weirder all the time. Garrett kept right on talking, as if she were keeping up. So if somebody were to come in through a window, they'd have to break the glass. You'd hear that. I'll grab a couple of motion sensor floodlights for outside, in case somebody decides to approach the house at night. Maybe a video camera. We'll have to price them. Anything else? Seems you've thought of everything. She was glad of it too, since she wouldn't have known where to begin. You could always get a satellite phone in case you're in the woods and need to make a call. She couldn't help the laugh. That feels a little extreme. He studied her a long moment, but said nothing. Before he could convince her that she needed a phone that would enable her to order pizza from space, she glanced at his laptop. Did you have something you wanted to show me? Right. Yeah, let's make a plan. Aspen scrolled through the images on Garrett's laptop. Odd. He could make this old place look like that? In the first picture, the old brown siding seemed fresh and new. He'd leveled out the front yard and added a walkway to the door. A few bushes and flowers made it look pretty and inviting. But it was his vision for the inside that had her jaw dropping. In the rendering, he'd removed the walls to open up almost the entire downstairs and added a semicircular island, bar stools and all, between the kitchen and living room. He'd rearranged the large appliances and sink so the layout made sense for both cooking and entertaining. In the dining area, he'd removed the small, solid door leading to the backyard and the window beside it and added glass French doors in their place. The adjacent wall held a bay window. The two walls now offered an expansive view of the forest, practically bringing the outside in. He'd even added furniture to show how it would look when it was finished. Garrett scooted his chair closer. I didn't open up the other space down here. I think the great room is large enough already, and that'd be a nice office. Do you mind? He inched his fingers toward the trackpad, and she moved to give him access. As lovely as the house on the screen was, his scent, some delicious combination of cedar and man, was just as attractive. Maybe more so. She leaned away and tried to focus on the images as he scrolled. We'd have to rebuild the stairs to the basement, move the opening closer to the front door. That sounds like a bigger undertaking than it is. But then we could. Finally, he stopped scrolling, and she saw what he meant. If we added French doors here, between the office and the hallway. I love that. The office doors would be just around a short hall to the great room, so it would be both private and accessible. Or we could build a closet in there and close it off. But since there's no full bath on this floor, yeah, it doesn't make sense as a bedroom. And there are 4 upstairs. Exactly. She glanced his way in time to catch a little smile. He scrolled to the next picture, this one of the interior of the office. Obviously, we have to replace all the old windows. Why is that obvious? Those old wooden windows might as well be sieves. What you'll spend on the windows, you'll save in your heating bill. I won't. He nodded. Your buyer will thank you. If you don't replace them, any buyer with half a brain, and every real estate agent, will know it needs to be done. It just makes sense for you to do it. So, since we have to do that anyway, why not put another bay here? It'd bring in so much natural light, which this place desperately needs. She could think of a few good reasons why not, the first being the expense, but it could look amazing. He'd already shown her what the place would look like with the changes she'd asked for, and she'd been happy with that plan. New countertops, new appliances, refinished flooring, fresh paint. It would be fine. But this was... It's wonderful. She turned his way as she said it. He'd inched closer and was so near that she caught the scent of mint on his breath. He cleared his throat and leaned back. Thanks. I've been putting these plans together for weeks, ever since Christensen. His Adam's apple bobbed, and he scooted his chair away. Obviously, the budget's much bigger on the second option. But I talked to a friend in real estate last week, and she seems to think you'll get back twice what you put into it, if you're willing to spend the money and spend it well. She was throwing out numbers in the 700 range. I know it's not Hawaii prices, but aside from what I spend to do the work, it'll be all profit. Exactly. Did you show her these plans? He nodded. Some of the ideas were hers, to level out the yard, for instance. She said it would improve curb appeal, which will add a lot to the value of the house without spending much money. I can see that. Aspen looked around, surprised to see the dingy space after looking at what it could be. She'd love to see that transformation, and she wouldn't mind the return either. How long will it take? He scooted his chair a little farther away, blowing out a breath as he did. That's the issue, of course. If we were to go with your plan, it'd take a month, maybe 6 weeks, depending on how quickly we can get the supplies. My plan will take twice that long at least. So 3 months? Maybe longer. I'm not one of those contractors who'll tell you 4 weeks when I know it'll be closer to 8. I'm trying to be as honest as I can here. Truth is, everything's in short supply these days. And if it's coming from overseas, I get it. I hope it takes less than that, but... His shoulders lifted and fell. It might take 4 months. Worst case scenario, 6. There are things out of my control. I can tell you that I'll do everything in my power to get it done as quickly as possible. And once we get going, if we're organized and have all the decisions made up front, you don't have to be here. You can do what you have to do and then go on to Florida. Where strangers don't glare at me and stalk me? Not that I'm in a hurry to get rid of you, but yeah. She scrolled the rest of the images to see updated bathrooms, clean and bright bedrooms, pretty light fixtures, new windows everywhere. It was gorgeous. If he could make this place look like that, she might want to stay. Well, if the town didn't hate her, that was. And it weren't so cold. She shivered at the thought and pushed the laptop back to him. The furnace guy is coming tomorrow, by the way. Thank God. He laughed and closed the lid. I'll let you think about it. Meanwhile, he stood and pushed in his chair. We should get going so we're not late to meet the phone installer. What do you need to do today? What she wanted to do was curl up in bed and spend some time with God. But she doubted Garrett would be willing to hang around while she did that. And he'd already said he wasn't leaving her alone at the house until he knew she was safe. Which was sort of overbearing and sort of sweet. Considering she didn't exactly want to be there alone, even in the light of this sunny day, she wasn't going to argue. I need to hit a Target or Walmart or something, a place where there's food and other household goods. And I need furniture. Okay, we should be able to get everything in Plymouth. If not, we can pop down to Tilton, but it's another half hour, so we should get going. I can go by myself. My errands will take a lot longer than yours. We can just meet back here later. His smile was disarming. Maybe he knew that. Maybe that was why he'd donned it. You tired of me already? You must have better things to do. Nope. Yours is my only job right now. Besides, I doubt you're going to fit everything you need, plus living room furniture, in the back of that SUV. He made a point. Come on, it'll be my pleasure.
Chapter 9. Rather than turn toward the interstate, Garrett detoured into the center of Coventry and parked downtown. I know I'm new to the area, Aspen said, but this isn't Plymouth. He gestured toward a thrift store. You've got money to play with, but why waste it on brand new furniture if you can find some used? This place usually has a decent selection. Great idea. Before she opened the passenger door, she flashed him a smile that had his heart doing a weird little flip. He met her on the sidewalk. Though there wasn't a cloud in the sky, the sun hadn't warmed the air much. Aspen pulled up her hood for the 30-second walk between his truck and the entrance. He could picture that wavy blonde hair blowing in the wind as she surfed. But all bundled up like that, she was adorable. She glanced his way. What are you smiling about? Nothing, nothing. He needed to remember that she was a client and that he was spying on her, which meant he could not get emotionally involved. But he wasn't truly spying. He was being a friend. If she decided to tell him something about her mother, he'd listen, and then he'd pray about what to do with the information. If God told him not to tell his uncle, then he wouldn't. Even if the thought of denying the uncle who'd saved his life sent acid to his stomach. He scooted ahead and held the door open for Aspen. Bells overhead announced their arrival as they stepped in. He pulled the door shut behind him. It was notorious for flying open at a gust of wind. Come on in, and make sure you got that door. The woman's voice faded as she looked up from behind a cash register. Oh, hey, Garrett. Hey, Trudy, this is Aspen. She's looking for some furniture. To Aspen, he said, Trudy goes to my church. Nice to meet you. Same, the older woman said. You two on a date? Did Aspen's cheeks turn a little pink? Probably just a remnant of the cold. She's a client, Garrett said. I'm helping her out. Trudy nodded, but she didn't seem convinced. What do you need? Pretty much everything. Aspen looked around and he followed her gaze. The place was nicer than other thrift stores he'd seen, with all the items neatly merchandised. Trudy not only employed people who were down on their luck, she also donated a portion of her profits, and a good deal of clothing and other items, to the local food bank. She'd opened the store to serve the poor, especially those who were too proud to take charity. Racks of clothes filled the front half of the store. Household and decorative items were behind that, and way in the back, furniture. He'd bought a sofa and recliner here when he'd first moved into his condo. You know where to go. Trudy turned back to her work. Yell if you need help. Aspen grabbed a shopping cart and headed down an aisle. Not sure if furniture will fit in that, but she beelined toward kitchen items. It's amazing the things you don't think about. She wasn't wrong. When he'd moved, Aunt Deborah had brought over everything she'd thought he might need, and a whole bunch of stuff he'd still never used. Aspen filled the basket with utensils and gadgets and dishcloths and plates and silverware and bowls. It went on and on. While she shopped, she checked items off in an ever-present notebook. He'd thought she was finished when she said, "Oh," and headed in another direction. He took the first basket, which she'd already filled, to leave by the register and grabbed a second. After she loaded it up, she looked up at him with a wide smile. That's almost everything I need besides furniture, food, and a few small appliances. He checked his watch. Record time. Huh, you want to talk records? Wait until you see the tally. A woman who could get that much shopping done in a half hour and save money to boot. She was getting more attractive by the minute. I'm going to take this up front. He wiggled the basket handle. The furniture's right, but she'd already started heading that way. When he returned, he found Aspen in front of a dingy brown sofa. An ugly, dingy brown sofa. She glanced at him. Is this too big? Do you like it? He hadn't meant his incredulous tone. It's dreadful, which probably accounts for the price. The giant yellow sticker, almost covering a pink sticker, and a blue sticker beneath, indicated it had been marked down more than once. He could see why. Not only was the color awful, but it was stained and he bent toward it. It smells, but the price. He took her elbow and guided her toward a gently used off-white sectional. What about this one? It's twice as much. Only because Trudy was practically paying someone to take the other off her hands. I thought I was cheap. I'm not cheap. I'm just trying to be wise, you know. I don't want to make any crazy decisions. He studied the better sofa. No stains that he could see on the fabric. No tears. He turned over the dangling price tag. This is an excellent brand. It'll last for years and it'll look great in the space. I'm not going to live here for years. I need to be rational. Okay. Hands on her shoulders, he shifted her back to the brown sofa. Go lie down on that thing. Rest your pretty hair against the fabric. Take a deep breath, in through your nose, and then decide. She took a few steps toward it and stopped, giving him a sheepish look. I see what you mean. He chuckled and yelled, She's taking the white sectional. Trudy called back, Got it. He looked down at Aspen. What else? You're satisfied with yourself, aren't you? He wasn't lying when he said, This is the first time I've ever enjoyed shopping. She smiled and moved along. It took a little time, but Aspen picked out a coffee table, an end table, an old entertainment center, and a couple of lamps. She also found 2 throw blankets for the sofa, light gray and dark blue, and some pillows to match. Because, you know, it's cold, and I might want to snuggle up in front of the fire. She said the words as if she had to justify her purchases. Good thinking. They were on their way to the front when he spied a display of winter gloves. He aimed her that direction. The ones you have are as impractical as they are pretty. I discovered that last night when my fingers nearly froze off. While he took her things to Trudy, who started ringing everything up, Aspen looked at her glove choices. When he returned, she lifted a pair. These'll work. He checked the tag. They were cheap for a reason. You should get a better brand. Is it that big of a deal? Said the woman who wore a hood to walk from the car to the door. It's freezing out there. Uh-huh. Okay, I see your point. She turned back to the display but seemed flummoxed. He snatched a pair, checked the brand, Hamilton Clothiers, and held them out. These. She slid them on, aiming a smile his way. They're really comfortable and warm, which would be the point. Wise guy. She punched his shoulder, but between the puffy gloves and his flannel shirt, he barely felt it. Ow, he deadpanned. That's not gonna leave a mark. Laughing, she headed toward Trudy, who he guessed had kept one eye on the whole exchange, definitely getting the wrong idea about him and Aspen. Except it didn't feel all that wrong. It felt right, which was, all things considered, very, very wrong. Garrett glanced toward his passenger seat, where Aspen's fingers were flying over her cell phone screen. He didn't mind. She had no service at her house, and she had things to manage. After hearing about her middle-of-the-night visitor, he'd wanted to stay by her side. Dumb, but the thought of somebody outside her house, watching, it raised a level of protectiveness in Garrett he hadn't known he had. Much as he wanted to ensure her safety, he hadn't looked forward to spending an entire day with her. Not because he didn't enjoy her company. He did too much. It was shopping itself he hated. But shopping with Aspen had turned out to be a breeze. After he bought the alarm and floodlights at the hardware store, he took her to a discount superstore, dreading it. He should have known better. She'd picked out $1,000 worth of furniture and household goods in less than an hour at Trudy's. She proved just as fast, efficient, and cost-conscious at grocery shopping. She chose the few household items still on her list, including a small microwave, a toaster, and 2 cordless phones in record time. Then headed to the food, where she led him down the aisles, snatching this and that along the way, all the while laughing, smiling, sharing stories about her life in Kona, not to mention rejoicing at the prices as if it were unimaginable to be able to buy a pineapple for $2, less than half what she usually spent. Don't they grow pineapples in Hawaii? She shrugged. Don't ask me to explain it. Just trust me. That he did. Despite Uncle Dean's suspicions, he found Aspen open and honest. They turned onto the highway back to Coventry by the time she set her phone down. Get everything taken care of. There wasn't much. My best friend lives in Nepal. She wanted to know how I was doing. We don't get to talk much with the time difference, so I caught her up on what's going on. Nepal? She and her husband are missionaries. How'd you become friends with her? They were in Kona for years. There's a big missionary organization not far from where I lived, and Dad and I were involved a lot when I was in high school and college. Jaslyn and I have been friends since I was 19. They moved a few months before Dad died. Must have been hard not having your best friend around. When Aspen didn't say anything, he glanced her way to find her nodding. She looked out the opposite window into the dense snow-covered woods. What was he like, your dad? Or is it too hard to talk about him? No, I like talking about him. She faced Garrett again. He was generous and funny and sweet. He worked a lot of hours, but when I was a kid, he always managed to be there for me. He owned a restaurant that was within walking distance of our apartment. Every day after school, he'd meet the bus and walk back to the restaurant with me. It was my favorite part of the day, just Dad and me catching up. While he worked, I'd do my homework, talk to the customers, clean off the tables. Even when I was old enough to stay home by myself, he preferred for me to be with him. And I did too. Garrett couldn't imagine. His own father had commuted from their house just north of the Massachusetts border to Boston every day, leaving before Garrett woke up and returning after dinner. The little time they had together, Dad had spent lecturing Garrett about his grades, or berating him about how he dressed, or how he should choose better quality friends, as if the kids at his expensive private school weren't good enough for him. Garrett said, "Your dad sounds like a good man. He was the best." Garrett detected emotion in her voice. He gave her a moment before asking, "How long ago did he die?" "It was a year on Tuesday. I thought it would be symbolic or something, starting this journey to fulfill his final wish exactly a year after his death. It was stupid. I cried all day long, and then had to get on a plane and travel. It's no wonder I'm still so tired." "And it hasn't exactly gotten easier this week?" She sniffed beside him, blew out a breath, and said, "I'm fine. It's fine." Her voice was forced cheerful. "It's okay to not be fine, you know." He looked her way and caught her eyes. "It's okay to grieve, and to be angry at your stupid nosy stalker guy. And Bart Bradley and all the rude people at the Patriot yesterday. You remind me a little of him." She let out a short laugh. "Not Bart. Your dad. I'm flattered. It's just, you're kind and you anticipate people's needs, like the way you got the house ready for me, and managed the phone and internet installation, and brought over the furniture this morning. The furniture was just taking up space in my aunt and uncle's garage. But you asked them for it and brought it. And most people don't ask about my dad. I guess they think maybe it'll be painful to talk about, or maybe they don't want to deal with my emotions." Dad would have asked too. He had a way of drawing people out, getting them to share. Like you, he genuinely cared about people. Garrett caught her shrug and looked her way, to find her cheeks were a little pink. And this definitely wasn't the cold. She was blushing. He might have been too. "Would it be pushing my luck to ask what your father's dying wish was?" After he asked, he drove a good mile before she spoke. "You heard me tell that guy at the restaurant yesterday that my mom's been missing most of my life." Garrett hadn't been trying to pry. He'd promised himself he wouldn't do that, but maybe he'd asked the right question to get the information his uncle wanted. He half wanted to change the subject before she could share, not wanting to be in the position of having to decide what to do with what she told him. But the other half of him was too curious to interrupt. "Dad told me that she was missing, and probably dead. He always referred to her in the past tense. My mom had some mental problems, and because of that, he didn't think she'd be able to disappear and never be found." Exactly what Uncle Dean had said. "All my life I've believed she was gone, but right before he died, he was having trouble breathing, and he didn't have enough time to say everything he wanted to say before they put him on the vent. He said he wanted me to find her and do right by her, whatever that means." "And you think she's here, in Coventry?" A moment or two passed before Aspen spoke, but she didn't answer his question. Dad was always frugal. How that was related, Garrett had no idea. You get that from him, I guess. He looked at her and caught her smile before returning his attention to the road. Even though, by the time he died, he owned 5 restaurants that were all doing really well, he and I always lived in apartments. We had everything we needed. Don't get me wrong. When I started managing the Kona restaurant, I saw how much money he was making in profit. It was significant, and the other restaurants did just as well, but I never questioned how we lived. I figured there were expenses I didn't know about, maybe debt or something, and then I found out about the house here, which he owned outright. But he didn't own it for long, Garrett said. Didn't he buy it a couple of years ago? She turned his way. How did you? When it came on the market, I tried to buy it. I thought it would make a good house to fix up and sell for profit. But your dad got it first. I mean, he bought it under the name of his company, so I didn't know it was your dad. Not that I would have recognized his name. So you've been thinking about redoing that place for a long time. He lifted a shoulder and let it drop. I hadn't seen the inside until Christensen talked to me about working for you. Did your dad tell you why he bought it? Nope. Do you think it has something to do with your mother's whereabouts? It must, right? Why else would he buy a house in New Hampshire? In fact, a part of me, her voice trailed. He waited a few beats before prompting her. Part of you? I sort of hoped I'd get to the house and she'd be there. My mom, cooking dinner or something. In my head, I knew that wasn't going to happen. All my life, even though I knew she was dead, because there's no proof deep down, I guess I hoped. It's stupid. He recalled Aspen's reaction to the house when she first arrived. He'd thought her overwhelmed by how much work it would take to make it decent. Turned out she'd been dealing with so much more. Before he realized what he was doing, he reached across the console and laid his palm over her hand resting on her knee. I'm sorry. He squeezed and then brought his own back to the steering wheel. He shouldn't have done that. She said nothing for a long moment, and then, as if nothing strange had happened, she continued. I'm thinking maybe there's something in that extra bedroom that'll give me a clue about where she is. He'd seen everything in that room. I don't think so. The stuff from the attic is older. The rest of it is pretty new. I'll look through it anyway. I have to start somewhere. True, though he dreaded the disappointment when she discovered nothing helpful. A few minutes later, he turned onto the mountain road that led back to her place. Would I be insane to go with your design for the house? She asked. Wouldn't a wise person just do the bare bones and sell it? Just the opposite. If you do that, you're going to have to sell it for cheap. It's a really nice house with a lot of potential. Why wouldn't you want to profit on that? What if the market shifts? What if it does? It's not going to be worth less than what you put into it. The economy would have to completely collapse for you to lose money. Even during the real estate downturn a decade ago, our housing prices held steady. There's no bubble up here. But it's a risk. A slight risk. He needed to stop trying to convince her. It wasn't his place to tell her what to do, and he had a vested interest in her, choosing his design. You should do what makes you comfortable. A moment passed before she said, My father took risks. Every restaurant was a risk. He opened a second location in Kona, and it failed. But that didn't stop him from trying again. Garrett nodded, though he was praying she'd choose his design over hers, for both their sakes. Okay, we'll do your design. You're sure? His heart pounded. I really don't mean to pressure you. It'll be beautiful, and if your real estate agent is right, I'll make back every penny and more. It's not like I need the proceeds immediately. I have the luxury of time. The more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that your plan seems like the best course of action. He barely resisted pumping a fist in victory. I think that's the right choice. Good. She lifted her phone. I made a list of the rooms that need to be dealt with as soon as possible. At this point, the kitchen is the most pressing. If you could start there, I'd really appreciate it. It doesn't work that way. We'll just have to... No, it needs to work that way. The kitchen is dingy and gross, and I really need it to be cleaned up if I'm going to live there. So start there, and then move on to... She rattled off the list of the rooms in the order that she wanted him to do them. There are supplies that need to be purchased, he said carefully, and subcontractors to hire. Those things might not fit into your plan. You'll figure it out. I mean, there's some wiggle room. If you'd rather do the office before the living room, that's fine. And the bedrooms upstairs can be done in any order you want, as long as they're done one at a time. And I'm going to help with the painting, so that'll make it easier. Cheaper for her, but not easier for him. He'd planned to hire a professional to paint. If you want it done quickly. Speed isn't the most important thing, she said. I have time. My time matters too. It won't make that big of a difference. He loved the confidence in her voice, especially coupled with the fact that she had no idea what she was talking about. Her plan wasn't going to work, but he didn't want her to change her mind about his design. Rather than argue further, he simply nodded, turning into the entrance to his condo complex. Where are we going? If he picked up a hint of nervousness in her voice, he figured it was about to get worse. Remembering her reaction when he'd suggested it earlier, he sent a smile her way to soften the blow. We're here to get you a handgun.
Chapter 10. By the time Aspen's phone, internet, Wi-Fi, and alarm system had been installed on Friday night, it was well past dinner time. Trudy's nephew had helped Garrett deliver Aspen's furniture from the thrift store while the phone installers were still there. When everyone else was gone, Garrett had stood in her living room, looking as nervous to leave her alone as she'd felt. But with her new phones, not to mention the security system and motion sensor lights he'd installed all around her house, and even along the driveway, she'd be safe. She'd shoot him out and promised to see him Sunday. She wasn't going to think about the handgun she had stowed in her nightstand drawer, nor the holster he'd convinced her to order online. She'd argued that she couldn't carry a concealed weapon without a permit, but apparently New Hampshire didn't require a permit. Quite a change from Hawaii, where one couldn't carry a concealed weapon at all. Did Garrett really think she was going to walk around packing heat like Annie Oakley? On Saturday, although she'd wanted to start digging through the stuff in the junk room, instead, she spent the day cleaning. The kitchen was the worst, grimy in spots that required lots of elbow grease, and the bathrooms had needed a good scrubbing as well. She'd thought she'd spend a couple of hours at that task, and was shocked when it was 4 o'clock by the time she finished and plopped down on her new sectional. She'd never been more thankful for a couch in her life. The furnace man had come by that afternoon, tinkered in the basement, and then spent 10 minutes explaining what he'd done, none of which she understood. He'd told her the furnace was in perfect working order, and the bigger problems were the insulation and windows. Until she took care of those, the temperature might go a few degrees higher, but that was as good as it was going to get. When he mentioned that her oil tank was full, she'd worked hard to pretend she'd known she had an oil tank. These were the kinds of conversations she'd never needed to have in Hawaii. As promised, the temperature in her house rose about 2 degrees. She was thankful for the stack of firewood Garrett had delivered. She was clearly going to need it. Sunday morning, she felt like a new person. Her house was clean. She had everything she needed to survive, all neatly organized in scrubbed and lined cabinets. She'd had 2 good nights of sleep in a row, and no sign of the stalker. She dabbed the last of her makeup on, then checked her reflection in the mirror over the sink, half wishing she'd bought a full-length one so she could see how she looked in her slacks and boots. She'd gone to the same church for as long as she could remember. The thought of trying a new one sent not butterflies to her stomach, but killer bees in a turf war. In the bedroom, her phone rang, the old-fashioned sound loud and jarring. Pressing a hand to her pounding heart, she hurried that way and snatched the cordless handset, pressing the button before she brought the giant thing to her ear. So weird. I thought I'd pick you up for church, Garrett said after her hello. Are you almost ready? I can drive myself. You saw where I live. It's not like it's that far out of my way. True. He was about 10 minutes down the mountain. She hadn't gone into his condo the other night when he'd grabbed the handguns. He'd brought out 3 so she could decide which felt the best in her hand, and the complex seemed new and well kept. Besides, Garrett added, we got a little snow last night. I thought you might chicken out on driving. She stepped to the window and looked outside. Sure enough, her driveway was white. You're sure it's safe? He laughed. I'm almost there. 5 minutes later, she climbed into Garrett's pickup, where tall coffee cups steamed in cup holders. She'd made her own that morning, but the temperature hovered somewhere in the what kind of idiot would live here range, so a second cup of something warm was perfect. On your website, it says you're a full-service general contractor, but this still seems outside your sphere of responsibility." He let out a low chuckle that had her insides thrumming with a reaction she wasn't ready to name. "I do like to please my clients." She clicked on her seatbelt, then reached for the cup nearer her, looking at him for permission. He nodded, and she grabbed it. "You'll have to tell me your preference," he said. "Personally, I love Josie's lattes, but she makes everything." That must be the owner of Cup of Josie's, where Aspen had gotten coffee her first morning in Coventry, which meant he'd driven to town, gotten the coffees, and then headed back up the mountain. In other words, he'd gone way out of his way. "Caramel macchiato, what's yours?" "Vanilla latte." "I'll buy next time." "Deal." He backed onto the road and headed toward town. As Garrett had said, his was an old-fashioned white church, steeple and all, that looked like it had been there for 100 years or more. There were many such churches in Hawaii. The first white settlers to the islands had been missionaries from New England, so the building weirdly reminded her of home. Rather than enter at the front, they walked into a lobby area beside the church, an addition, Garrett explained, that connected the sanctuary with the building next door, which housed classrooms. Garrett's friends made a beeline their way. James introduced his wife, Cassidy, who was cradling their newborn, Hallie. Reed introduced Jackie and his daughter, Ella, who Aspen would guess was about 6. Thomas was there too. She also met Andrew and Grace, who were engaged, and Fitz and Tabby, who'd just moved back to town. And Dylan and Chelsea. Apparently, Chelsea owned Hamilton, a big clothing manufacturer located in Coventry, the company that made the gloves Garrett had insisted Aspen buy. She might suspect he'd steered her that direction out of loyalty, but the gloves really were very warm. Tabby, the curly-haired brunette, said, "Hey, we're having a girls' night tomorrow at my house. Do you want to come?" "Oh, did she?" "That's a great idea," Grace added. "I live in the condos down the street from you. Why don't I pick you up, about 6:20? She looked at the faces of all the women, waiting to see what she'd say. Did she want to get to know them better? She wouldn't mind having a friend in town besides Garrett, even if she would only be there a short time. Beyond all the smiling faces of Garrett's friends, Aspen had caught more than one stranger looking her way, people her father's age or older. They definitely weren't wearing the welcoming expressions she'd expect to see at church. Were they like that with all the guests? Somehow she doubted it. Yes, she definitely needed friends on her side. "I'd love to come. What can I bring?" Tabby said, "Whatever you want, or nothing. We always have way more than we can eat." Buoyed by the invitation, Aspen followed Garrett further through the addition and up a short flight of stairs. They'd almost reached the sanctuary when she felt a touch to her shoulder. "Are you Aspen?" She turned to a tall man, 6'2" at least, with salt and pepper hair and warm brown eyes. By the wrinkles, she'd guess he was her father's age, early 50s. But, unlike her father, who developed a paunch, this man was trim and fit. She'd heard the expression about people's eyes lighting up, but she'd never really understood it until that moment. When he looked at her, it was as if his whole expression brightened. "You look just like your mother." People were streaming around them toward the double doors just ahead. Music filtered out. Garrett nudged the small of her back. "Maybe we should get out of the way." The man shook his head quickly. Sorry, can we just—" He backed out of the crowd and into a corner. She followed, feeling both nervous and excited. Here was somebody who looked at her, saw her mother, and didn't despise her for the resemblance. She liked this guy already. When they were out of the stream of parishioners, he held out his hand, which she shook. "I'm Brent Salcedo." Before she could introduce herself, he said, "And you're Aspen. I'd heard you were in town, but even if I hadn't, I'd recognize you anywhere." "Nice to meet you." Behind her, Garrett said, "I can wait for you inside, if you two need to." "It's all right," Brent said, then focused on her again. "I just wanted to introduce myself and welcome you to Coventry. What brings you here?" "My father passed away a year ago." "I'm sorry, I hadn't heard. That must have been very difficult. Yes, thank you. Anyway, she'd been about to tell this man about the house, but at the last second, she shifted. Maybe this person truly was a friend, but she felt like she had enough foes in Coventry that she needed to be cautious. He used to talk about Coventry all the time. I wanted to see it for myself, get a sense of where he and my mother lived. You picked an interesting time to come. Unless you're a skier, you might prefer to visit in the summer. I wanted to experience a winter here. She exaggerated a shiver. I had no idea that air could be so cold. When Brent smiled, his whole face got involved, lifting his cheeks and crinkling the skin around his eyes. Where did you grow up? On the big island of Hawaii. Wow, this is different then. He slipped his hand into his jacket. He wore a suit, though most people dressed more casually, and came out with a business card, which he held out to her. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate. My wife and I are at your service. He lowered his voice and leaned closer. Your mother and I were good friends. She thanked him, pocketing the card, and he slipped into the crowd, entering the sanctuary. To Garrett, she said, Do you know him? Everybody knows him. He's the mayor. Should we? He nodded toward the double doors. The crowd had dwindled, and the volume of the music was steadily building. Fortunately, Andrew and Grace had saved them seats, and they were able to slip in just as the worship team started singing. Aspen recognized all the worship songs, and their familiarity made her feel comfortable. The pastor was apparently in the middle of a sermon series on the book of Ephesians, one of her favorites because it had taught her who she was in Christ. The reminder that, though her earthly father was gone, her heavenly Father was right by her side, brought fresh peace. As much as she'd pressed into him in the year since Dad's death, she feared she'd need God's guidance now more than ever. After the service, Aspen and Garrett were following the crowd toward the lobby when a man approached. Aspen Kincaid? He stood out of the way of the church members streaming into the cold morning as if he'd been waiting for her. She moved toward him, feeling Garrett at her side. Have we met? He held out his hand. Only on the phone. Jeff Christensen. Over her shoulder, Garrett said, Hey, Jeff. Aspen, I'll see you outside. Garrett walked out, and she and her father's local attorney moved farther from the crowd into the corner. I just wanted to introduce myself, he said. Have you gotten settled? I have. Garrett's been a great help. Thank you for recommending him. The man nodded. Barely taller than Aspen's 5'6", he was older than her dad would have been, probably in his mid to late 60s, with a ring of gray hair around a shiny bald head. Have you made a plan? He asked. Jeff had encouraged her to sell the house immediately, but she'd wanted to come here and fix it up first. When she'd told him that, he'd suggested she do so from Hawaii. No sense traveling all the way to New Hampshire, he'd said. I can manage the details on this end. He'd been surprised when she'd called in November to say she was coming. More than surprised. He'd tried to talk her out of it. She'd detected a hint of, she wasn't sure what it was. Not displeasure so much as concern when she'd told him her plans. She'd forgotten about that until this moment, maybe because she detected the same thing on his face now. Garrett has some great ideas, she said. Come to think of it, it wouldn't be a bad idea to get Jeff's feedback. He thinks that if we redo the entire house, I'll get a lot more money out of it than if I just do the bare bones. What do you think? Define redo, he said. She gave him a quick rundown on what they planned. His bushy gray eyebrows lowered over light brown eyes. That's a huge undertaking. He can do it though, right? You said Garrett? He's more than capable, and the numbers sound right, but you're not going to stay the whole time, are you? The way he asked the question had her defenses rising. She crossed her arms. Why shouldn't I? I just thought, don't you have a business to run back in Hawaii? I sold it. The attorney's gaze darted behind her, and she was tempted to turn and see why. She could tell by the lack of noise that most of the church had already filed out. This conversation, and the lawyer's concern over her staying in town, seemed very important. Is there something I should know, Mr. Christensen? Please call me Jeff. What do you mean? Yeah. I've been getting a lot of strange looks since I got to town, and some older guy questioned me the other day about my mother's whereabouts. Lots of people are curious about what happened to your mother, he said. It was a scandal back then. What kind of scandal? Look, your father moved to Hawaii to protect you. Wait, she processed his words, then asked, Did you know my dad before? He bobbed his head once. Your dad and I go way back. She hadn't told Jeff about Dad's last words, figuring he'd handled the purchase of the house and nothing else. But, now that she thought about it, why had her dad needed a lawyer in New Hampshire? He had one in Hawaii who'd managed his business and his will and trust. A person didn't need to hire a lawyer to buy a house, right? To clarify, she asked, So you knew him when my mother disappeared? When he moved away? Knew you too, he offered a grandfatherly smile. You were the prettiest baby I'd ever seen. She wasn't going to get sidetracked. Did you know my mother? He shifted on his feet and cleared his throat. We met, of course, but I didn't know her well. What can you tell me about what happened back then? Young lady, I'm 31. She didn't mean the words to come out curt, but she wasn't a child. He needed to see her as a capable adult, not the baby he'd known before. For good measure, she added, and I deserve to know. Your father left for a reason. He didn't want you involved. There's nothing to be involved in now. It's been 3 decades. I just want to know. I'm sorry, but it's not my place. Dad sent me here. Did he tell you that? The old man's eyes snapped wide. What do you mean? Before he died, he told me to come here, and now she did turn to see who might be listening, because it seemed there were people in this town who weren't on her side, and her business was not theirs. But the lobby was empty. Still, she lowered her voice. Can I trust you to keep this to yourself? I've been acting as your attorney since your father died, so attorney-client privilege applies. On his deathbed, my father asked me to find my mother and do right by her. I have no idea what he was talking about, but he mentioned the house. Do you have any idea what he wants me to look for? Before she stopped talking, Jeff's head was shaking. He took a step back. Your father must have been delirious. Was he on painkillers or something? Your mom's been missing a long time, and nobody knows what happened to her. The confident words coming out of his mouth did not match the fearful expression on his face. Why are you lying to me? He rubbed his lips together, and his gaze darted all around the lobby. Your mother is gone, Aspen. There's nothing you can do to change that. Coming here and stirring up the past is only going to cause trouble. For who? You? I had nothing to do with it. With what? What is it? Whatever happened to your mother, it had nothing to do with me. I just know that there are people in Coventry who won't take kindly to you digging up things that should remain buried. Before she could argue, he slid an age-spotted hand over her forearm. His grip was strong. Go back to Hawaii and your life there. Let Garrett fix up your house, and I'll handle the sale. You don't need to be here. My father? Forget what your father said. He shouldn't have put this on you. It's not your responsibility. She was my mother. She was... He pressed his lips together. I know she was suffering from a mental illness. My father told me that much. He relaxed the tiniest bit. She did a lot of damage and left nothing but destruction in her wake. That's not your fault, but people around here have a long memory. The fact that you look just like... There you are! Aspen turned as a woman walked toward them from outside. She was heavy-set with pretty silver hair and giant round sunglasses, which she pushed up on the top of her head. As she approached, Jeff cleared his throat. Maury, this is Michael Kincaid's girl, Aspen. The older woman smiled at Aspen. I'm Jeff's wife, by the way. You're gorgeous, just like your mother. She held out her hand, and Aspen shook it. You knew my mom? Oh, not well. She waved the words off, so casual, especially compared to her husband. We met a few times. She was a fiery one, your mother. I've never met anybody with so much passion. Passionate, fiery. Aspen had rarely heard a positive adjective used to describe Jane Kincaid. She gripped the words like a life-saving drug. About what? Oh, everything she cared about. She was in college, and there was something. She turned to Jeff. Was it nuclear power plants? He shrugged. Something about the environment. He sounded too casual. He knew more than he was saying. Maury didn't seem to notice. And she was charismatic. Everybody loved her. I once saw her stir up a group of mommies into demanding a nursing room downtown. Aspen smiled, trying to imagine such a thing. Did they add it? Nobody defied Jane Kincaid. Maury said the words with a little laugh before turning to Jeff. The kids are holding a table for us. We'd better hurry. Jeff said goodbye, and Aspen watched as the older couple walked out the door, reeling from all the information she'd gotten. Her mother had been passionate and charismatic, and everybody had loved her. This was the first she'd heard anything like that. Aspen wished the facts had stopped there, but Jeff's words were the ones that resonated. Your mother did a lot of damage and left destruction in her wake. And there were people who didn't want Aspen digging into what that meant. But who and why?